The roar of surf mixed with the crack of German rifles. On the sand of Omaha Beach, the first waves of vehicles sat stalled, their waterproofing ripped open by shell fragments. A bulldozer pushed a burning truck aside while ordnance sergeants waded through the shallows, marking lanes with tape. Smoke from the bluffs above drifted down across the crowded shoreline. The invasion of Europe hung on the ability to clear that beach. Men from the Ordnance beach maintenance groups worked without cover, their only protection the steel helmets on their heads. They pried open crates, checked the seal on ammunition cases, and signaled to the landing craft where to drop their ramps. A half-track loaded with 105mm howitzer shells nosed through a gap in the obstacles. Behind it came a jeep towing a trailer of spare parts. This was the moment everything had to work. The plan called for thousands of tons of supplies to cross the sand each hour, but the enemy had not read the plan. Machine gun fire chewed the edge of a stack of ration boxes. An ammunition truck blew up 50 yards from the waterline, scattering flaming debris across the beach. The ordnance men kept moving, dragging equipment clear, building the first dumps with the tide coming in. But that beachhead was still years away when the first American ordnance officer set foot in London. In the spring of 1941, there was no plan for a cross-channel invasion, no landing craft, no stockpile of ammunition in the British Isles. The war was 12,000 miles wide, and the Ordnance Department had to build a global supply system from scratch. The starting point was a small office in a bombed-out apartment building on Grosvenor Square. The Ordnance member of the Special Observer Group arrived in London late in May 1941. His task was to lay the groundwork for cooperation with the British War Office, to study their supply methods, and to plan for the day when American troops would arrive in the British Isles. The British were desperate for weapons. Their army had lost enormous quantities of equipment at Dunkirk the year before, and the Luftwaffe was still battering their cities. The ordnance officer found that the Royal Army Ordnance Corps handled almost everything a soldier needed, from rifles to boots, while the Ministry of Supply designed and manufactured the weapons. It was a system very different from the American Ordnance Department, which both built and supplied its own armament. He had to learn these differences quickly. Within days of his arrival, the officer was assigned to committees planning for the garrisoning of Iceland. That island sat astride the North Atlantic convoy routes, and its defense was vital to both Britain and the United States. He flew to Reykjavik on the 9th of June with a reconnaissance party. He found the British ammunition storage deplorable, with too much stock concentrated in flimsy Nissen huts or left in the open. He recommended a complete reorganization of the depot system. The ordnance plan for Iceland called for medium maintenance companies, ammunition companies, depot companies, and aviation companies to support a reinforced division. He calculated the tonnages of ammunition, the spare parts for artillery, and the tools needed to keep weapons functioning in the volcanic landscape. The plan was sound, but the troop movements were delayed by political restrictions on sending selectees outside the United States. It would be autumn before the first American soldiers reached Icelandic soil. While Coffey worked in London, a far more ambitious operation was taking shape in Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt, on the 13th of September 1941, ordered the War Department to contract with civilian companies to operate supply and maintenance depots in the Middle East. The British were fighting Rommel in the Western Desert and needed American tanks, trucks, and repair shops close to the front. The Ordnance Department began planning a network of installations stretching from Egypt to Iran. A colonel designed the Ordnance Middle East tasks, known as OMETs. There were 7 of them: a base depot at Bombay, a tank overhaul plant at Port Elizabeth in South Africa, an intermediate depot at Asmara in Eritrea, another at Karachi in India, a large advanced depot near Cairo, a repair facility in Palestine, and a workshop at Tehran for equipment destined for the Soviet Union. The J.G. White Engineering Corporation was selected to build and operate them. The estimated cost was $71 million, but the OMET plan was hardly on paper before events overtook it. Pearl Harbor shifted American priorities overnight. The German advance in North Africa made fixed installations vulnerable. The British insisted on controlling spare parts, a decision that frustrated American planners at every turn. By the spring of 1942, most of the OMETs had been scaled down or scrapped. The only substantial American tank shop in the region was the one at Heliopolis, near Cairo. While the Middle East planning unfolded, another American military mission was landing in China. The American military mission to China, known as AMISCA, arrived in Chungking on the 9th of October 1941. The ordnance officers found a Chinese army armed with 1,000,000 rifles of European and Japanese manufacture, supported by only 800 artillery pieces. The arsenals were operating at one-quarter capacity because raw materials had run out. The Chinese needed everything: metals, explosives, machinery, small arms ammunition, and training in the use of modern weapons. But the logistical bottleneck was the Burma Road, a narrow, congested highway that could carry only a trickle of supplies from Rangoon to the interior. Soderholm and Leybourne could not make plans faster than the Chinese National Military Council could approve them. The Japanese advance into Burma soon closed the road entirely, and the mission shifted its focus to India. On the morning of December 7, 1941, a different kind of American mission was at sea. The Pensacola convoy, consisting of the transports Republic, Chaumont, Meigs, and Holbrook, and 3 freighters, was steaming southwest across the Pacific. Aboard the Republic was the ground echelon of the 7th Heavy Bombardment Group, including an Ordnance Aviation Bombardment Company under a young lieutenant. The ships were bound for the Philippines. The radio message came at 1100 hours. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The captain of the Republic announced the news over the intercom. The convoy prepared to defend itself. Cargo holds were searched for weapons, and 4 British 75mm guns were lashed to the deck, though there was no ammunition for them. The men painted the superstructures grey and stood watches at improvised gun mounts. The war had found them in mid-ocean. The convoy was diverted to Brisbane, Australia, arriving in Moreton Bay on the 22nd of December. It was midsummer in Australia, and the men saw palm trees and strange flowers lining the riverbanks. The troops debarked and were taken to racetracks and airfields for temporary quarters. Burn C. Manson and his Ordnance Company were assigned to the Doomben racetrack. The first American headquarters in Australia was established in a hotel room that afternoon. The Pensacola convoy had brought approximately 1 Ordnance Company to Australia. The ships carried not only that company, but also aircraft, bombs, guns, and anti-aircraft ammunition. The cargoes were scrambled, the manifests vague and incomplete. Manson and his men worked through Christmas Day, reloading the fastest ships for a desperate attempt to reach the Philippines. They ate cold bologna sandwiches for Christmas dinner. The attempt failed when the Japanese captured the islands. On the 8th of January 1942, the Special Observer Group in London was redesignated the United States Army Forces in the British Isles, with a theatre commander as its leader. But the headquarters was understaffed and poorly informed of Washington's plans. The ordnance officer had only 2 other ordnance officers to help him plan for the arrival of tens of thousands of American troops. The War Department had not yet grasped the scale of what was coming. General Cheney submitted urgent requests for more staff, including ordnance officers for aircraft armament and depot operations. The response was meager. The first increments of a headquarters force did not arrive from the United States until April. Coffee relied on borrowed officers from the military attaché's office to cover the work. The situation was, in Cheney's own words, extremely grave. The first American troops to deploy to the British Isles under the plan code named Magnet landed in Northern Ireland on the 26th of January 1942. They were greeted by bands and cheering crowds, but no ordnance troops came with them. The General Staff had cut them from the sailing manifest. The ordnance officer at General Headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Daniels, called this a serious mistake, and events soon proved him right. Without ordnance troops, the units in Northern Ireland had no one to sort and store the weapons, ammunition, and vehicles piling up on the docks. The 79th Ordnance Depot Company, scheduled to arrive in February, was delayed when its ship developed engine trouble and turned back to Halifax. A single medium maintenance company and a 12-man ammunition detachment had to support the entire 10,000-man force for more than 2 months. The work backlog grew by the day. By June 1942, when the Northern Ireland Base Command was organized, the ordnance situation had improved. The 79th Depot Company and a second medium maintenance company had arrived. The bulk of the 1st Armored Division landed aboard the Queen Mary in mid-May, bringing tanks, half-tracks, and supporting vehicles. Storage facilities were cramped because the British troops had not yet departed, but the ordnance units began to establish dumps and shops. The build-up had finally begun. Half a world away, the Japanese bombed Darwin, Australia on the 19th of February 1942. The raid caught the small northern port by surprise. Ships burned in the harbour. and the airfield was strafed. Among the Americans on the scene was Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan L. Holman, who had just arrived in Australia with the Remember Pearl Harbor group. His immediate task was to salvage weapons and equipment from bombed and sunken ships. Jonathan L. Holman had been selected for the Ordnance section of the new command in Australia. He had brought with him 5 officers, 6 enlisted men, and $300,000 in ordnance funds. The money was used for local procurement and for storing the ammunition that came in with the convoy. Holman set up his office in Melbourne, in the Repatriation Building on St Kilda Road. The work was overwhelming from the start. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia on the 17th of March 1942, having escaped from the Philippines. He assumed command of the Southwest Pacific area. Jonathan L. Holman became the Chief Ordnance Officer for the American forces in Australia. The job was to support the air operations against the Japanese on New Guinea, to protect the Australian ports and cities, and to build a logistical base for future offensives. All of this had to be done with very few troops. The Ordnance troops in Australia in the spring of 1942 consisted of a few aviation companies, 1 anti-aircraft maintenance company, and sections of depot and ammunition platoons. There was not a single ground maintenance company in the country. Holman dispersed his men across 7 base sections, from Darwin in the north to Perth in the west. Each port needed ordnance men to unload ships, assemble crated vehicles, and service the guns of the local fleet. The Southwest Pacific area was officially established on the 18th of April 1942. Jonathan L. Holman now operated under the United States Army Forces in Australia, which was part of General MacArthur's command. The Ordnance Office continued to support the air forces, the anti-aircraft units, and the growing number of ground troops arriving from the United States. The personnel shortage remained acute. Holman pressed Washington for more units, but shipping was scarce. On the 1st of May 1942, Holman activated the 360th Ordnance Composite Company. It was made up of depot and ammunition detachments that had arrived individually in March. The Composite Company was sent to Alice Springs, a remote settlement on the overland route to Darwin. There, the men operated a transshipment point for ammunition and supplies moving north by truck. The conditions were primitive. Water was scarce, and the flies were relentless. Jonathan L. Holman believed that Ordnance troops should not be lost inside large general bases. They should have their own facilities where they could live, work, and train together. This was the origin of the Ordnance Service Centre concept. The first such centre was established at Geelong, across the bay from Melbourne. It included an ammunition depot, maintenance shops, and a staging area for incoming troops. The model worked so well that it was replicated across Australia. By June 1942, the Northern Ireland Base Command was functioning, and the first American ammunition depots in the British Isles were being established. The sites included Savernake Forest, Marston Magna, and Cinderford. John W. Coffey in London was now part of a larger organisation. The European Theatre of Operations, United States Army, was established on the 8th of June. General Eisenhower arrived to take command, and the build-up code named Bolero began in earnest. Colonel Everett S. Hughes arrived in London by air on the 8th of June to become the Ordnance Chief for the Services of Supply. He brought with him a procurement officer and a small staff. Their mission was to receive, store, and issue the mountains of equipment that would soon be pouring into British ports. Hughes established his headquarters at One Great Cumberland Place. The Ordnance section of the European Theatre was born. The SOS Ordnance Chief arrived later in June. He took charge of general supply, while Colonel Albert L. Ford handled maintenance and Colonel Albert S. Rice managed ammunition. The staff was still small, but the plans were enormous. Bolero called for 1 million American troops in the British Isles by April 1943. Everything those troops needed had to be stored somewhere. The first Ordnance branch depot in England was established at Tidworth, on the edge of Salisbury Plain. It had been a British tank and artillery shop, with 133,000 square feet of workshop space and 50,000 square feet of storage. The depot was activated on the 22nd of July 1942. Until September, it was operated entirely by British civilians, because no American depot troops had arrived. The cooperation of the British Army was indispensable. Ammunition storage in England followed a different pattern from anything the Americans were used to. The British stacked ammunition along the sides of roads, under the shelter of trees, using portable corrugated iron huts for cover. The depots at Savernake Forest, Marston Magna, and Cinderford were built on this principle. Each stack was camouflaged with leaves poured over a wet asphalt coating. The system was practical for a country where land was scarce and invasion was feared. The United States Army Services of Supply in the Southwest Pacific area was activated on the 20th of July 1942, replacing the earlier USA Fire Organization. Brigadier General Richard J. Marshall took command of the new headquarters, and Jonathan L. Holman was appointed its chief ordnance officer. This reorganization gave Holman direct control over all ordnance units in Australia, consolidating the scattered base sections under a single logistical command. The supply lines to New Guinea remained long and vulnerable, and the shortage of troops continued to frustrate every effort at efficiency. Holman now had direct control over all ordnance units in Australia. He could move companies from one base section to another as the tactical situation demanded. The ordnance service centres at Geelong, Brisbane, and Townsville became the backbone of the supply system. Each centre had a maintenance shop, a depot for spare parts, and a staging area for troops in transit. The flexibility of the system was about to be tested. The first test came with the transfer of motor vehicle responsibility from the Quartermaster Corps to the Ordnance Department, effective September 1, 1942. Jonathan L. Holman inherited approximately 22,000 vehicles, including 15,000 trucks, 3,000 trailers, and 2,500 sedans. More than 6,000 of them had been purchased in Australia or salvaged from Dutch distress cargoes. He also inherited the maintenance problems. Holman had 10 quartermaster motor transport officers and 4 quartermaster maintenance companies. The officers were asked to stay with Ordnance for at least 6 months. The companies were redesignated as Ordnance units. The work was overwhelming. Trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Spare parts were scarce, and the poor Australian roads destroyed suspensions and axles. Holman appealed to Washington for more automotive maintenance units. The motor vehicle transfer caused upheaval in the United States as well. The Chief of Ordnance knew that his department had not been given time to train enough mechanics. He appealed to the automobile manufacturers and dealers for help. Thousands of experienced mechanics volunteered for service. They would arrive in the theatres later in 1942 and 1943, but in the meantime the field commanders had to improvise. The Ordnance Service Centre at Cooper's Plains, near Brisbane, was established on the same model. It housed a maintenance shop of 10,000 square feet and a general supply depot of 20,000 square feet. The centre supported the 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions, which were training for jungle warfare. The work was done by the 37th Ordnance Medium Maintenance Company and the 84th Ordnance Depot Company. Both units were under Holman's direct control. In New Guinea, Burns C. Manson arrived at Port Moresby in late August 1942 to take charge of ordnance operations. He found a port battered by Japanese air raids, with broken windows in the bungalows and bomb craters in the dirt streets. The ammunition stocks were low, the maintenance parts were unbalanced, and the personnel was stretched thin. Manson had 1 anti-aircraft maintenance detachment and a few aviation ordnance men to do the work of a full depot company. The grass fire on the 15th of September 1942 at the central dump at 4 Mile Airdrome demonstrated the vulnerability of ammunition stored in the open. The flames moved fast, dense black smoke rose into the sky, and bombs and ammunition began to detonate. Manson's men tried to extinguish the fire with wet burlap bags. They risked their lives dragging ammunition cases to safety. Large quantities of bombs, fuses, and small arms ammunition were lost. The loss was especially painful because it happened on the same day the first American combat troops arrived in New Guinea. The 126th Infantry of the 32nd Division landed by air, their fatigues still wet from the jungle dye applied the night before. They moved immediately up the Kokoda Trail to reinforce the Australians. Manson had to provide them with ammunition and weapons parts, but his dumps were depleted and his men were exhausted. The coastal supply route to Boona was established in October 1942 with a fleet of small trawlers. These shallow draft vessels could navigate the coral reefs and primitive landing places along the northern coast of New Guinea. On the 11th of October, 8 trawlers departed Port Moresby with rations and ammunition for the troops being flown over the Owen Stanley Range. 2 ordnance men from the 32nd Division headquarters, First Lieutenant John E. Harbert and Technician William C. Featherstone, were aboard to handle the ammunition. The trawler operation was dangerous. The waters were uncharted, the reefs were hidden, and Japanese aircraft patrolled the coast. The ships had no air cover, Their deck-mounted machine guns were the only defense. The first landing at Pongani on the 18th of October was successful, but a B-25 bomber, mistakenly identified as an enemy aircraft, dropped bombs that killed the commander of the small ship section and a war correspondent. The operation continued despite the losses. By early November, the coastal supply line had improved. The Australians had charted the waters around Cape Nelson, and larger vessels could now reach Porlock Harbour. From there, the trawlers carried supplies forward to Menderopu, Oro Bay, and Mbogo. An advanced dump was planned at Hariko, close to the Buna front. The system was working, but it was fragile. Everything depended on the small ships and the skill of their crews. In the British Isles, the preparations for Operation Torch were accelerating. The decision to invade North Africa had been made in July 1942. The build-up in England was now focused on equipping and shipping the Centre Task Force, which would land at Oran under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall. The 2nd Corps Ordnance officer arrived in England to begin planning the ordnance support for the invasion. Urban Niblo had a new concept for organizing ordnance troops in combat. Instead of attaching maintenance units individually to divisions, he planned to form a provisional ordnance group controlled directly by the Corps Ordnance officer. The group would include medium maintenance companies, heavy maintenance companies, designated with Q for quartermaster origin, ammunition companies, and depot companies. The group headquarters would direct their operations, shifting units where they were needed most. The Torch convoys began leaving the United Kingdom on the 22nd of October 1942. They carried 68,000 American troops and 56,000 British troops. The cargo included 288,000 long tons of supplies, of which more than a third was ordnance material. Vehicles accounted for 28% of the tonnage, weapons and equipment for 11%. The ships were heavily loaded, and the weather was rough. Waterproofing was a new problem. The vehicles had to be able to drive through salt water from the landing craft to the beach. The British had developed a sealing compound that could protect engines, electrical systems, and running gear. Ordnance officers worked with British engineers to apply the compound to thousands of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks. Metal fording stacks were fitted to exhaust pipes to keep engines from flooding. The stacks had to be jettisoned quickly after landing so the tanks could fire. Henry B. Saylor, now the chief ordnance officer for the European theatre, managed the supply effort from Cheltenham. His staff worked night and day to fill requisitions. The depots at Tidworth, Ashchurch, and Rushden were combed for equipment. Spare parts were a constant problem. For some vehicles, there was less than one boxed lot of parts in the entire theatre. Saylor ordered the dismantling of 75 new 2.5-ton trucks to provide spare parts for North Africa. On the 8th of November 1942, the Centre Task Force landed at Oran. The Rangers went ashore first, followed by the 1st Infantry Division. The French were taken by surprise. The landing craft were hidden by smoke screens laid by the Royal Navy. The only serious resistance was triggered when a sergeant fired a mortar shell that burst into a pyrotechnic display of the American flag. The French had an excellent target then, and they opened fire. Urban Niblo was aboard the transport orbiter. He watched the assault columns climb the heights above Arjo, the Maracaibo tank landing vessels grounded on the beach, and the light tanks of Combat Command B rolled ashore. The waterproofing held. By mid-morning, the reconnaissance elements were moving inland. Niblo could not disembark until late afternoon because the Navy was short of landing craft. When he got ashore, the quays were already clogged with equipment. Major George L. Artemanoff, who spoke fluent French, went ahead of the main ordnance party to secure depot sites. He entered Oran on the 10th of November, the day the city surrendered. He found the Nouvelle Halle market and requisitioned it for depot space. He also located a villa just vacated by the Italian naval delegation, with a tennis club nearby that could serve as offices and mess. When Niblo arrived the next day, the ordnance headquarters was ready. Artemanoff's language skills and initiative would be used again, as he was later ordered to Algiers to represent ordnance on the French Rearmament Commission and train resistance fighters. The follow-up convoy from England arrived on the 11th of November, bringing thousands of ordnance troops. They disembarked at Mers el Kabir and were taken to camps around Oran. The units included the 14th Medium Maintenance Company, the 53rd and 66th Ammunition Companies, the 30th Heavy Maintenance Company, and 2 automotive maintenance battalions. Urban Niblo now had the troops to form his Provisional Ordnance Group. With the necessary troops now available, Niblo completed the organization of the Provisional Ordnance Group into 3 battalions. The 1st Battalion handled heavy maintenance and depot operations in Oran and Arjo. The 2nd Battalion provided medium maintenance to units outside the cities. The 3rd Battalion, formed when the headquarters of the 62nd Ammunition Battalion arrived on 28 November, operated the ammunition dumps. The group was commanded by Niblo himself, with Lieutenant Colonel Russell A. Rose as his executive officer. The first job of the Provisional Ordnance Group was to assemble crated vehicles. Ships had brought thousands of trucks packed in cases, with the chassis in one crate, the cab in another, and the axles in a third. The ordnance men set up assembly lines near the docks. French labourers, many of them inexperienced, worked alongside the troops. One day they were found filling dry batteries with wine from the casks on the docks. The work continued despite such mishaps. The trucks were desperately needed. The combat units had sailed with only 60% of their authorized vehicles. The ordnance men assembled the crated trucks, serviced them, and drove them to the motor depot at Nouvelle Halle for issue. Many trucks went straight into service without a thorough road test. The demand was relentless. Urban Niblo also purchased French trucks wherever he could find them, paying in silver dollars. Many were in poor condition, but they kept the supply lines moving. In Tunisia, the British First Army had lost the race to capture Tunis and Bizerte. German reinforcements were pouring in from Italy. General Eisenhower ordered Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division forward to help the British. The movement began on the 23rd of November. The tanks had to travel hundreds of miles over mountain roads, many of them on their own tracks because there were no tank transporters. The wear and tear was severe. Urban Niblo ordered the 1st Battalion of the Provisional Ordnance Group forward to support the combat troops now in Tunisia. Lieutenant Colonel Russell A. Rose commanded this forward echelon, which comprised the 53rd Ammunition Company, the 14th Medium Maintenance Company, Company D of the 87th Medium Automotive Maintenance Battalion, and the 78th Depot Company. The battalion moved out from Oran on the 30th of November, traveling east by truck in a convoy of 183 vehicles. The destination was Souk El Arba in northern Tunisia. The worst loss of the early Tunisia fighting was suffered on the night of the 10th and 11th of December. During the withdrawal from Mejez El Bab, scores of tanks, half-tracks and tank destroyers bogged down in the mud and had to be abandoned. Combat Command B lost 32 medium tanks and 46 light tanks. The mud was so deep that even the Germans could not pull them out. The tank fleet was crippled. Urban Niblo ordered the 30th Ordnance Heavy Maintenance Company forward with all available spare parts and wreckers. The company left Oran on the 14th of December, carrying replacement tanks on its 4 40-ton transporters. It also took 2 10-ton wreckers and a convoy of cargo trucks. The journey took 4 days over steep mountain roads with corkscrew turns. When the company arrived at Souk El Arba, it found the front under constant air attack. The ordnance maintenance detachments ranged across the front in small contact parties, each consisting of a single vehicle and a handful of men. They visited tank units, infantry battalions, and anti-aircraft batteries, repairing weapons and vehicles wherever they found them. The detachment sent south to support Colonel Edson Raff's parachute force, operated behind enemy lines. The danger from German aircraft was constant. Niblo requested machine guns for every ordnance technical vehicle. The supply line from Oran to the front was 500 miles long. The Mediterranean base section at Oran was still being organized. Colonel Gerson K. Heiss, the ordnance officer there, had no depot equipment, no record cards, no bins, and few trained clerks. He relied on local labor. The Arabs stole weapons and ammunition. They cut the canvas tops off jeeps and stole the rope grommets from 155mm projectiles to make shoes. Heiss pressed on despite these difficulties. Back in the Pacific, the sea supply route to Buna suffered a disaster on the 16th of November. A flotilla of small ships and a Japanese barge, carrying the bulk of the ammunition for the attack on Buna, rounded Cape Sudeste late in the afternoon. 17 Japanese Zeros swooped down, using incendiary ammunition. The Bonwin and the barge began sinking. The Alacrity and the Minamura burned to the waterline. The ammunition was lost. The only cargo saved was the ammunition on a barge being towed by the Alacrity. First Lieutenant John E. Harbert remained on the barge under repeated strafing. throwing overboard the flaming fragments that fell from the schooner and extinguishing the fires that started. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism, but the loss of the other cargo forced General MacNeeder to postpone his offensive until the 19th of November. The attack on Buna began on the morning of the 19th of November. The 32nd Division soldiers moved through swamps and jungle against Japanese bunkers built of coconut logs. The bunkers were impervious to rifle and machine gun fire. The Australian 25-pounders could not destroy them. The Americans had brought no artillery of their own. The Ordnance maintenance detachments under Lieutenants Harbert and Keane worked 5 to 10 minutes behind the front lines, repairing weapons with hand tools. The 105mm howitzer codenamed Dusty was flown to Dobodura on the 26th of November. It could destroy bunkers with a single high-explosive round using a delay fuse, but the ammunition ran out in less than a week. No resupply was available. The howitzer was silenced for 2 weeks. The ordnance officers at Port Moresby and Brisbane worked frantically to get more ammunition forward, but transportation was unequal to the demand. On the 1st of December 1942, General Robert L. Eichelberger took command of the American forces in the Papua campaign. He brought with him Colonel Marshall E. Darby as the ordnance officer. Darby established a rear detachment at Port Moresby to control ammunition supply and coordinate with the 5th Air Force. He bypassed normal channels to radio directly to Brisbane for 105mm ammunition. The lack of artillery support was crippling the offensive. The ordnance lessons of the Papua campaign were hard won. Salvage of weapons from the battlefield was critical. Rust destroyed rifles and machine guns faster than the enemy could. Cleaning and preserving materials were in such short supply that men used motor oil and captured Japanese lubricants. The Ordnance Service Centres in Australia began manufacturing cleaning kits and oil containers. The war in the jungle consumed equipment at a rate no one had predicted. In the British Isles, the last torch convoys sailed in December. The ordnance stockpiles in England were depleted. Henry B. Saylor assessed the effort. The troops had sailed with sufficient ammunition, thanks to British depots, but shortages of automotive spare parts and certain weapons would have to be filled later. The theatre had been stripped to support North Africa. The build-up for the cross-channel invasion would have to start almost from scratch. The year 1942 was ending with the Ordnance Department stretched across 3 continents. In Australia, Jonathan L. Holman had built a base system from almost nothing. In England, Henry B. Saylor had organised depots and vehicle parks. In North Africa, Urban Niblo had formed the first provisional ordnance group. In New Guinea, Burns C. Manson had kept the supply lines open against overwhelming odds. The foundation had been laid, but the war was only beginning. The Ordnance Service Centre concept, pioneered by Holman in Australia, was proving its worth. Instead of losing units in large general bases, ordnance troops operated their own installations with their own mess halls, workshops, and depots. The centres could receive, equip, and stage troops arriving from the United States. They could perform maintenance, store ammunition, and issue supplies. The concept would be adopted in other theatres as the war progressed. The lack of ordnance troops and equipment in Australia had forced Holman to improvise. He used aviation ordnance companies for port work. He had maintenance detachments operating in 4 different locations with equipment designed for one. He relied on Australian workshops and British cooperation. Out of this necessity came the service centre model, which provided flexibility, control, and efficient use of scarce resources. It was a pattern for future base operations. The Pensacola convoy, which arrived in Brisbane on the 22nd of December 1941, had carried the first American Ordnance Company to Australia. That company, the 453rd Aviation Bombardment, had been split among 3 ports. Its men had armed blockade runners, trained Australian gunners, and unloaded cargoes in the subtropical heat. They had lost their first officer, Lieutenant Kane, on a desperate mission to supply the Philippines. Their story was the story of the entire ordnance effort in the Pacific. The Pensacola convoy itself was a microcosm of the early war. It had sailed in peacetime, been caught by war in mid-ocean, and diverted to a destination no one had planned. Its cargoes were scrambled, its units incomplete, its mission uncertain. The men had improvised gun mounts from pipe stands and lashed 75mm guns to the decks. They had crossed the line of the equator on the 6th of December. The next day, the world changed. The Ordnance Department had entered the war with a handful of officers in London, a few sergeants in Egypt, and a lone company at sea. 6 months later, it was supporting combat operations in New Guinea, supplying the build-up in England, and preparing for the invasion of North Africa. The growth was not orderly. It was driven by crisis, shortage, and improvisation. But the system was learning. The men in the field were finding out what worked and what did not. What worked was flexibility. What worked was giving ordnance officers control over their own troops and supplies. What worked was local procurement, British cooperation, and the willingness to use whatever was at hand. What did not work was separating troops from their equipment, relying on civilian contractors in combat zones, and assuming that stockpiles in the United States could be delivered on demand. Every theater learned these lessons in its own way. As the war moved into 1943, the challenges would only grow. The German 88mm gun, which George B. Jarrett had shipped from North Africa to Aberdeen Proving Ground, was exacting a terrible toll on American tanks. The tank transporters that the Ordnance Department had not procured were proving essential. The amphibious techniques developed for torch would be refined for Sicily and Italy. Each campaign taught something new, and each lesson had to be applied quickly. George B. Jarrett had found the first 88mm gun on the battlefield near Sidi Rezeg. He had taken it apart, loaded it onto trucks, and flown it to the United States in 2 C-47 aircraft. The gun reached Aberdeen Proving Ground, where it was studied, tested, and eventually countered by the conversion of the American 90mm anti-aircraft gun to anti-tank use. That was one of the most important technical intelligence operations of the war, and it happened because a single ordnance officer was on the spot. The lack of tank transporters in Tunisia was another lesson that had to be learned the hard way. The British 8th Army had tank delivery regiments to carry combat vehicles from bases to the front. The American 2nd Corps had 10 transporters. When the tanks bogged down in the mud at Mejez el Bab, there was no way to pull them out. The loss of 78 tanks in a single night was a catastrophe. The Ordnance Department would not forget this lesson. The work of the Provisional Ordnance Group in North Africa demonstrated the value of centralized control. Urban Niblo could move battalions forward or back as the tactical situation demanded. He could concentrate maintenance units where the fighting was heaviest and shift ammunition companies to new dumps as the front moved. The group headquarters provided command and control that would have been impossible with a scattered regimental structure. The concept was validated in combat. Henry B. Saylor in England was already planning for the next phase. The vehicle parks at Ashchurch, Tidworth, and Rushden were being expanded. The assembly plants in the Liverpool area were increasing their output. The ordnance depots at Savernake, Kingham, and Cinderford were receiving new shipments of ammunition. The build-up for the cross-channel invasion, codenamed Overlord, would dwarf everything that had gone before. Saylor knew that the Ordnance Department would need thousands more troops, thousands more vehicles, and millions more rounds of ammunition. John W. Coffey, who had started it all in London, was now in the United States, helping to prepare the Western Task Force for Torch. He had served as the Ordnance Liaison Officer during the critical early months when the alliance with Britain was being forged. The Iceland Plan, the liaison committees, the British liaison, all of it had laid the groundwork for the massive cooperation that would follow. He had carried the Ordnance mission from the first uncertain meetings in London through the launching of the first American offensive, and his work had helped lay the foundation for the campaigns that followed. The war in the Pacific was about to enter a new phase. The Papua campaign was drawing to a close. The Japanese were being pushed back, but the cost had been high. The 32nd Division had lost hundreds of men to disease and combat. The ordnance troops had worked themselves to exhaustion. The supply lines from Australia to New Guinea had been established, but they were still fragile. The next offensive, the drive up the coast of New Guinea, would require even more support. Burns C. Manson had received the Legion of Merit for his work at Port Moresby. He had kept the ammunition flowing, established dumps, and supported the combat troops despite shortages of men, equipment, and supplies. He had begged for more personnel and been refused. He had seen his men work 7 days a week, underfed and overworked, in the heat and mud of New Guinea. He had done everything that could have been done with what he had. After Papua, Manson continued to serve in the Southwest Pacific, applying the hard-earned lessons of the campaign to the logistics of later operations, and was eventually reassigned to the United States before the war ended. The Ordnance Service Center at Cooper's Plains in Brisbane was now the model for similar installations across the theatre. It had a maintenance shop, a general supply depot, and facilities for staging troops. It was operated by the 37th Ordnance Medium Maintenance Company and the 84th Ordnance Depot Company. The centre at Townsville was growing rapidly. The centre at Geelong was handling ammunition for the entire theatre. The system was working. The United States Army Services of Supply in the Southwest Pacific area, under Brigadier General Marshall, had given Holman the authority he needed to organize ordnance operations. The 7 base sections each had an ordnance officer who reported to Holman's office. The depots, shops, and ports were linked by a communication system that was slowly improving. The railroads from Adelaide to Alice Springs, from Brisbane to Mount Isa, were carrying more supplies. The system was not yet efficient, but it was functioning. The Ordnance Department had learned that motor vehicles were its biggest challenge. The transfer of responsibility from the Quartermaster Corps had brought thousands of trucks, jeeps, and trailers under ordnance control. The maintenance of these vehicles consumed more man-hours than all the weapons, fire control instruments, and combat vehicles combined. The ordnance officers in the field estimated that automotive work constituted 80% of their total effort. This was a reality that the planners in Washington had not fully anticipated. The North African campaign had exposed the vulnerability of long supply lines. The 500 miles from Oran to the Tunisian front consumed fuel, trucks, and time. The ports were inadequate. The railroads were limited. The Luftwaffe attacked convoys and dumps. The ordnance officers learned to store ammunition in dispersed dumps, to maintain contact teams forward, and to cannibalize damaged equipment for spare parts. These lessons would be applied in Italy and, later, in France. The campaign in New Guinea had exposed the vulnerability of primitive supply routes. The trawlers, the barges, the airdrops, and the native carriers were all vulnerable to weather, enemy action, and simple mechanical failure. The ordnance officers learned to package ammunition for airdrops, to improvise cleaning materials, and to salvage weapons from the battlefield. They learned that jungle warfare consumed equipment at an appalling rate. They learned that maintenance in the mud required constant vigilance. As December 1942 drew to a close, the Ordnance Department had troops in every active theatre. They were in Northern Ireland, England, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Australia, and New Guinea. They were in Iceland and the Caribbean. They were in Alaska and the Aleutians. They were in India and China. The global support system was being built, piece by officers and men who had learned their trade in the proving ground of war. Jonathan L. Holman in Melbourne could look back on a year of extraordinary achievement. He had arrived with a handful of officers and $300,000. He now commanded an organization of 145 officers and 3,500 enlisted men. He had established 5 ammunition depots, 5 maintenance and supply depots, and an ordnance service center that would become the model for the theater. He had taken over motor vehicle supply and maintenance. He had supported 2 infantry divisions and 15 air groups. In October 1943, he was promoted to Chief of Staff of the United States Army Services of Supply in the Southwest Pacific area, and after the war he returned to the United States, his work done. Henry B. Saylor in Cheltenham had overseen the reception, storage, and issue of equipment for the largest overseas deployment in American history up to that time. The torch operation had been mounted from the British Isles in 2 months, against all odds. The depots were functioning, the vehicle parks were operational, and the ammunition supply was adequate. Saylor knew that the real test was still ahead. The invasion of Europe would require 10 times the effort of Torch. Urban Niblo in Oran had proven that the group concept could work in combat. The Provisional Ordnance Group had supported the initial landings, established base depots, and sent battalions forward to the front. The organization was flexible, responsive, and under ordnance command. Niblo was already planning to expand the group into a permanent ordnance organization for the Fifth Army. The lessons of Tunisia would be applied to Sicily and Italy. The Ordnance Department had entered the war in May 1941, with a few observers in London. 18 months later, it was a global organization supporting combat operations on 3 continents. The growth had been chaotic, painful, and costly in terms of mistakes. But the system had learned from its mistakes. The service centers, the group headquarters, the contact teams, the technical intelligence units, the amphibian truck operations, all of these innovations had emerged from necessity. The war was far from over. The Germans held Tunisia and Sicily. The Japanese held the Solomons and the Dutch East Indies. The invasion of Europe had not yet begun. The Ordnance Department would need more troops, more equipment, and more supplies than anyone could yet imagine. But the foundation had been laid. The men in the field knew what to do. They had learned the hard way, and they would not forget. In New Guinea, the battle for Buna was grinding to a close. The Japanese were being pushed back into the sea. The 105mm howitzers were finally receiving ammunition. The tanks were advancing. The ordnance maintenance men were salvaging weapons and repairing vehicles. The fighting was savage. The conditions were terrible, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The first American offensive in the Pacific was succeeding. In North Africa, the Second Corps was preparing for the next phase. The supply lines were being improved. The ports of Oran and Algiers were handling more cargo. The depots were being stocked. The ordnance units were repairing the tanks lost at Medjez el Bab. The group concept was being refined. The campaign in Tunisia would resume in the spring, and this time the Americans would be ready. In the British Isles, the build-up for the invasion of Europe was accelerating. The vehicle parks were filling with trucks and tanks. The ammunition depots were receiving shipments from the United States. The ordnance officers were studying the lessons of the Dieppe raid and the Torch landings. They knew that the invasion of France would be the greatest amphibious operation in history. They were determined that the Ordnance Department would not fail. In Australia, the ordnance service centres were expanding. The ports of Brisbane, Townsville, and Melbourne were handling more cargo. The supply lines to New Guinea were being improved. The ordnance troops were training for the next campaign, the drive up the coast of New Guinea toward the Philippines. The lessons of Papua were being applied. The jungle cart, the six-wheeled jeep, the floating depot, all of these innovations were moving into production. The year 1942 ended with the Ordnance Department in a position it had not occupied 12 months earlier. It had a global organization, a combat-tested doctrine, and a cadre of experienced officers and men. The improvisations, the shortages, the mistakes, and the hard-won victories had created a system that could support the largest war in history. The guns were still firing, and the Ordnance Department was keeping them firing. The Pensacola convoy had brought the first ordnance company to Australia. The company had been split into detachments and scattered across a continent. The men had slept on racetracks, eaten cold rations, and worked in the rain. They had armed ships, trained Australians, and unloaded cargoes in the subtropical heat. They had lost Lieutenant Kane. They had kept going. That was the Ordnance Department in 1942. That was the foundation on which victory would be built. By January 1943, the situation in Tunisia had turned grim. The race for Tunis had failed, and the Germans were pouring reinforcements into the port cities of Bizerte and Tunis. General Eisenhower made the decision to go over to the defensive and move the American Second Corps forward to Tebessa. The supply line from Oran to the front now stretched over 500 miles of mountain road. Every gallon of gas, every round of ammunition, every spare part had to travel that distance. The Mediterranean base section at Oran was still barely organized. The men of the Ordnance Provisional Ordnance Group had established a forward depot at Souk El Arba. But the winter rains turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Supply trucks bogged down and convoys were delayed for days. German dive bombers controlled the skies over the forward areas. They attacked supply convoys at will, and there was little the Allies could do to stop them. The Luftwaffe had concrete runways at Tunis. Allied aircraft were stuck in the mud. Ammunition dumps had to be camouflaged with whatever scrub brush could be found. Stacking ammunition along the roadside, British style, made it easy to reach but also easy for enemy aircraft to spot. The threat of air attack was constant. Colonel Urban Niblo, the ordnance officer of Second Corps, had organized the Provisional Ordnance Group into 3 battalions. The 1st Battalion had been sent forward to Souk El Arba. It was the only American supply unit at the front. The 1st Battalion of the group was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Russell Arose. It consisted of a heavy maintenance battalion, a medium maintenance company, a depot company, and an ammunition company. The men lived in tents and worked in the mud. The 78th Ordnance Depot Company was the only source of supply for American troops at the front. It handled not only ordnance gear, but also signal corps equipment and clothing. The men worked around the clock to keep the combat units supplied. The 53rd Ammunition Company established dumps near the railheads at Duvivier and Souk Aras. From there, trucks carried the ammunition forward to the gun positions. It was slow, dangerous work under constant threat of air attack. Contact parties from the maintenance units ranged up and down the front line. They traveled in small trucks, carrying spare parts and tools. They visited tank units, infantry battalions, and anti-aircraft batteries spread over a wide area. The maintenance men found the tanks in poor condition. Many had made the long road march from Oran on their own tracks. The running gear was worn out, and spare parts were scarce. The lack of tank transporters had taken a heavy toll. On the night of December 10th and 11th, German forces had attacked at Mejez el-Bab. The American tanks tried to withdraw but bogged down in the mud. 78 tanks were abandoned, stuck fast in the mire. The loss was crippling. The Germans could not pull the tanks out either. The mud was simply too deep. Combat Command B had lost half its armoured strength in a single night. The 30th Ordnance Heavy Maintenance Company, a tank maintenance unit, was rushed forward from Oran. It brought the Corps' remaining tank transporters, carrying light tanks forward to replace the lost vehicles. At the time, 2nd Corps possessed only 10 of these scarce machines in total. The tank transporters were a new piece of equipment for the American Army. The British had used them in Egypt for months. The American Ordnance Department had not foreseen the need for them in North Africa. The lack of tank transporters was one of the earliest and harshest lessons of the campaign. Without them, tanks had to travel on their own tracks, wearing out engines and transmissions. The lesson would echo through the rest of the war. By February, the 2nd Corps had moved its headquarters forward to Tebessa, near the Algerian-Tunisian border. The plan was to launch an attack toward the coast at Gafsa. This would cut Rommel's supply line and trap his forces. The supply situation was becoming critical. The 500-mile line from Oran could barely sustain the troops already in Tunisia. Adding more divisions would strain it to the breaking point. Colonel David J. Crawford, the ordnance officer at Allied Force Headquarters, worked to improve the flow of supplies. He established a depot at Constantine, closer to the front. But the railroad was already overloaded with British traffic. The eastern base section was established at Constantine in late February. Ordnance troops began to build up stocks of ammunition and spare parts. But the process was slow, and the front was consuming supplies faster than they could arrive. American troops were going into battle without their full complement of equipment. Some units had arrived in North Africa without their artillery pieces. The ships carrying the guns had been diverted to other ports. The system of shipping unit equipment separately from the troops had broken down. A howitzer might arrive on one ship, its sights on another, and its ammunition on a third. The men at the front were left waiting. The ordnance base at Oran, under Colonel Gerson K. Heiss, tried to sort through the chaos. French and Arab laborers helped unload the ships, but they were untrained, and many items were misidentified or lost in the confusion. Motor vehicles were a particular problem. The decision to ship only 60% of wheeled vehicles with the troops had been a mistake. The remaining 40% arrived in crates and had to be assembled on the docks. Colonel David J. Crawford, who had coordinated ordnance supply from Allied Force Headquarters through the worst of the Tunisia crisis, went on to serve as the senior ordnance officer for the North African Theatre, overseeing the logistical improvements that made the later campaigns possible. The assembly of crated vehicles was a major operation. Men worked day and night, fitting together chassis, cabs and axles. Many trucks arrived without brake fluid or battery electrolyte. French laborers once filled dry batteries with wine. Despite all the difficulties, Ordnance kept the trucks rolling. The men of the Ordnance Group improvised and adapted. They cannibalized new vehicles for spare parts and scavenged broken equipment for usable components. The Germans struck at Kasserine Pass on February 14th. It was a major offensive aimed at driving the Americans out of Tunisia. The attack hit the 2nd Corps hard. American tanks were no match for the German armor. The M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks mounted 75mm guns, but the German 88mm anti-aircraft guns could penetrate their armor at 2,000 yards. The 88mm gun weighed nearly 5 tons and fired a 20-pound projectile. It had been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but the Germans used it as an anti-tank gun with devastating effect. At Kasserine, the 88s fired from concealed positions on the high ground. American tanks advanced into killing zones without knowing where the fire was coming from. One after another, they were knocked out. The defeat at Kasserine was a brutal education. American tactics were poor, and the equipment was inadequate. The 88mm gun was a terrifying surprise for men who had been told their tanks were the best in the world. The 88 was not new to American intelligence. Captain George B. Jarrett had captured one near Sidi Rezek in late 1941 and shipped it to Aberdeen Proving Ground. But the lessons from that captured gun had not yet translated into new weapons. Jarrett continued his technical intelligence work throughout the North African campaign, providing critical data on German weapons that influenced later American anti-tank development, and he retired after the war as a colonel. The Ordnance Department had begun work on a 90mm anti-aircraft gun that could be adapted for anti-tank use. But the development was slow. American industry was still tooling up for mass production. The immediate response to Kasserine was to rush more tank destroyers to the front. The M3 half-track and the M10 tank destroyer mounted 75mm and 3-inch guns. These were better than the Sherman's gun, but still no match for the 88. The urgent need was for a tank that could fight the German Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. This need would drive American tank development for the rest of the war. But it would take time. After the shock of Kasserine, the Allies regrouped. General Eisenhower brought in fresh troops and replaced the commander of 2nd Corps with Major General George S. Patton. The Ordnance Group prepared to support a new offensive. Patton's first task was to restore American confidence. He ordered an attack toward Gafsa on March 17. The ordnance units moved forward with the infantry, establishing supply points as they advanced. The push through Gafsa was a test of the Ordnance Group concept. The battalions were mobile and could shift support as the front moved. Ammunition dumps were leapfrogged forward, always within reach of the guns. Maintenance units followed close behind the combat troops. They set up roadside repair points where damaged tanks and trucks could be fixed quickly. The men worked in whatever shelter they could find. The advance was rapid. Gafsa fell on March 20th, and the Americans pushed east toward the coast. The ordnance supply lines stretched further, but the experience gained in the earlier months made it work. By late March, the Allies were closing in on the Axis forces in Tunisia. The British Eighth Army was advancing from the east, and the Americans were pressing from the west. The end was in sight. Ordnance support for the final offensive was a massive effort. Thousands of tons of ammunition were moved forward. Tank transporters finally arrived in numbers, allowing tanks to be moved without wearing out their tracks. The maintenance units worked miracles to keep vehicles running. Engines were replaced in the field, and damaged hulls were patched with armor plates salvaged from knocked-out tanks. The mechanics worked around the clock. On May 7th, American troops entered Bizerte. The port was a wreck, but ordnance teams moved in to clear the docks and establish supply points. The campaign was reaching its climax. The Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered on May 13th. The campaign was over. American troops had gained hard-won experience, and ordnance had learned lessons that would shape the rest of the war. The Ordnance Group had proven itself in combat. The flexibility of battalion and group organization was the key to effective support. The group concept would be used in every subsequent campaign. The need for adequate tank transporters was now fully understood. American industry began producing heavy transporters in quantity. They would be used in Sicily, Italy, and France to move tanks to the front line. The vulnerability of American tanks to German 88mm guns was a shock. The answer was thicker armor and a more powerful gun. The Ordnance Department accelerated work on the M26 Pershing tank. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun was adapted for anti-tank use. It was mounted on the M36 tank destroyer, and later on the Pershing tank. The 90 could match the 88 in penetration and range. The lessons of North Africa were applied to planning for the next operation. The invasion of Sicily, code-named Husky, was already being prepared. The amphibious expertise gained at Oran would be put to use. On the night of July 9th, the Allied invasion fleet approached the coast of Sicily. The sea was rough, and many soldiers were seasick, but the operation went ahead as planned. The American 7th Army, under General Patton, landed at Gela and Skogliti. The British 8th Army landed further east. The objective was to seize the ports and airfields of southern Sicily. For the first time, the Americans used the Duyuke, a 2.5-ton amphibious truck. It could drive off the landing ramp, swim through the surf, and continue inland on the roads. The DUKW was a vital new tool. Ordnance units landed with the assault waves. They had practiced waterproofing and beach crossings in England. The lessons of Oran were applied, and the landings went more smoothly. Colonel Thomas H. Nixon was the ordnance officer of the 7th Army. His job was to keep the ammunition and supplies flowing across the beaches. It was a massive task. The beaches at Gala were narrow and congested. Landing craft backed up offshore, waiting to unload. Ordnance troops worked in the surf, dragging ammunition boxes up the sand. The DUQ proved their worth. They could ferry supplies directly from ships anchored offshore to the inland dumps. This bypassed the congested beaches and kept the supply line moving. Vehicle losses in the surf were lower than at Oran. The waterproofing techniques had improved. The DUKWs were more stable than the earlier landing craft. The campaign in Sicily was fast-moving. Patton's tanks raced north to capture Palermo. The ordnance supply line had to keep up. The 2nd Armored Division used its tanks aggressively. Maintenance units followed close behind, setting up repair points wherever they could find cover. The tank transporters from Tunisia helped move damaged tanks back to the rear. Ammunition supply was a constant problem. The infantry fired thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition every day. Artillery battalions burned through their shells in hours. Nixon struggled to keep the forward dumps stocked. The roads were narrow and winding. German rearguards destroyed bridges and blocked passes. Despite these obstacles, his supply lines held, and he remained 7th Army's ordnance chief through the conclusion of the Sicilian campaign, before moving on to plan support for the invasion of the Italian mainland. The 88mm guns appeared again in Sicily. German gunners used them against tanks and infantry, but the Americans had learned to call in artillery and airstrikes to suppress them. The fighting in the hills of Sicily was brutal. American tanks could not maneuver on the steep slopes. Infantry had to take the high ground one hill at a time. Ordnance men went forward to repair weapons in the front lines. They replaced barrels on machine guns and fixed jammed rifles. They worked under mortar and sniper fire. The Germans fought a skillful delaying action. They withdrew slowly, mining roads and demolishing bridges. Ordnance engineers cleared the mines and repaired the roads. By mid-August, the Axis forces were cornered on the northeastern tip of Sicily. They began evacuating across the Strait of Messina. The Allies could not stop the evacuation. Messina fell on August 17th. The campaign in Sicily was over in 39 days. The Allies had gained a foothold in Europe, and the next target was the Italian mainland. The lessons of Sicily were clear. Amphibious operations needed careful planning and specialized equipment. The Ordnance Department had learned how to support a fast-moving campaign across beaches and mountains. The DUKW was recognized as an essential piece of equipment. Production was accelerated, and more DUKOs were sent to every theater. They would play a vital role in the invasion of Normandy. The next step was the invasion of mainland Italy. The target was Salerno, south of Naples. The landings would be the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in the European theater. The 5th Army, under Major General Mark Clark, would make the assault. Niblo was now the ordnance officer of 5th Army. His group organization from Tunisia would be expanded and refined. The Salerno landings began on September 9th. The Germans were waiting. The beaches were heavily defended. The first waves of landing craft came under heavy fire. German artillery zeroed in on the beach exits. Vehicles bogged down in the soft sand. The ordnance beach groups worked under shell fire to clear the exits. They bulldozed paths through the dunes and laid steel matting for the trucks. The men called it hell in the dunes. Ammunition dumps were established behind the beach. German aircraft attacked them at night. Fires burned and ammunition cooked off. The harbour at Salerno was too small to handle the flow of supplies. Everything had to come over the beaches. The DUKOs worked day and night, ferrying cargo from ships to the shore. Niblo's ordnance organization was tested to the limit. The provisional structure he had improvised in North Africa was now carrying the full burden of supporting a field army in crisis. The group concept proved its worth in the chaos of the Salerno beachhead. Maintenance units set up in the rubble of Salerno. They repaired tanks and trucks in the streets, using whatever tools and parts they had. The work never stopped. The Germans counterattacked on September 12th and 13th. They nearly drove the Americans back into the sea. The battle hung in the balance. In the crisis, ordnance men fought as infantry. They manned the perimeter and held the line. Some of them never returned to their tools and spare parts. Naval gunfire and air support turned the tide. The Germans withdrew, and the beachhead was secure. The Fifth Army began to advance inland. The Salerno landings had been a close call. The Germans had nearly thrown the Allies back into the sea, but the ordnance support had held. The lessons of Salerno were applied immediately. Beach groups were reorganized and better equipped. The amphibious techniques that would be used at Normandy were being refined in the Mediterranean. The campaign in Italy settled into a grinding slog. The Germans withdrew to strong defensive positions in the mountains. The Allies advanced slowly, paying for every mile in blood. Ordnance support in the Italian campaign was a test of endurance. The supply line stretched from Naples northward through the mountains. Winter rain and mud made every convoy a struggle. The Ordnance Group concept continued to evolve. Niblo's battalions were reorganized and streamlined. The experience of North Africa, Sicily, and Salerno was distilled into new tables of organization. The battle for Italy would continue into 1944, but the lessons learned in the Mediterranean campaigns were already shaping the future. The invasion of France was being planned. The 88mm gun remained the deadliest threat to Allied tanks. The Ordnance Department responded with a 90mm gun on the M36 tank destroyer. More powerful tanks were on the drawing boards. The need for tank transporters was now fully accepted. Heavy transporters were rolling off American assembly lines. They would be waiting in England when the invasion of France began. The Ducos had proven their value in Sicily and Salerno. They would be mass-produced and used in every amphibious operation. The Ordnance Department was learning how to supply a modern army from the sea. The Provisional Ordnance Group had grown from a makeshift organization into a standard model. Every American army and corps would have an ordnance section organized along similar lines. The group concept was now official doctrine. The Mediterranean campaigns had been a brutal testing ground. The Ordnance Department had learned what worked and what did not. The lessons were applied to the planning for the greatest amphibious operation in history. The men who had fought through Tunisia, Sicily, and Salerno were veterans. They knew how to support a modern army in combat. They would take their experience to the beaches of Normandy. By late September 1943, the Fifth Army had pushed north from the bloody beaches of Salerno. The Ordnance Group organization that Niblo had forged in North Africa and tested in Sicily was now evolving into a more permanent structure. The Provisional Ordnance Group had proven its worth, but the Italian campaign would demand even greater flexibility from the support troops. The mountains and rivers of the Italian peninsula were about to become a new kind of proving ground. Naples fell on the 1st of October, and the port city became the new base for Fifth Army Ordnance. The docks were a wreck of sunken ships and demolished warehouses, but the engineers and ordnance troops went to work immediately. Crated vehicles began to arrive, and assembly lines were set up in the rubble. The lessons of Oran were applied: get the trucks running, get them to the units, keep the supplies moving north. The ordnance battalions under Niblo were reorganized into a more streamlined group structure. 4 battalions now handled the full range of support: supply, maintenance, ammunition, and heavy repair. The group headquarters provided command and control without the administrative burden of a regiment. This was the model that would soon be adopted as standard for all American armies. The maintenance companies set up shops in the cellars of bombed-out buildings and under canvas in the muddy fields outside the city. Tanks and trucks that had broken down on the advance from Salerno were towed in and repaired. The men worked in shifts around the clock, often by flashlight. Spare parts were still scarce, but the supply line from the ports was beginning to function. Ammunition dumps were established along the route north, carefully camouflaged against the German reconnaissance aircraft that seemed to appear every clear day. The 105mm howitzer rounds were stacked in the open, covered with tarpaulins and netting. Smaller items went into caves and stone farmhouses. The ammunition companies learned to spread their stocks thin, avoiding the concentration that had invited disaster in the desert. By mid-October, the Fifth Army was pushing toward the Volturno River. The Germans were withdrawing in good order, blowing bridges and mining roads as they went. The ordnance contact parties moved with the forward battalions, repairing weapons and vehicles under fire. It was a slow, grinding advance, and every mile stretched the supply line a little longer. Winter arrived in November, and the Italian campaign became a battle against mud and rain. The roads turned into rivers of sludge. Supply trucks bogged down by the dozens. The ordnance maintenance companies worked in the downpour, pulling vehicles out of ditches and replacing broken axles. The cold was a new enemy, seeping into engines and freezing batteries overnight. The search for better organization continued. Niblo and his staff studied every breakdown in the supply system, every delay in getting parts to the front. The group structure was refined. Each battalion was given a specific sector of the front to support, with its own maintenance and ammunition companies. This decentralized system allowed faster response to the needs of the combat units. Niblo's organizational model became the standard for Fifth Army and was later adopted by all American field armies in Europe. He continued as Fifth Army Ordnance Officer through the Italian campaign and into the occupation, eventually retiring with the rank of Brigadier General after a career that had shaped the ordnance support of modern warfare. The supply difficulties of the Italian winter revealed a fundamental truth. The ordnance support system had to be as mobile as the combat troops it served. Fixed depots far to the rear could not keep up with the advance. The answer was to push ordnance units forward, closer to the front, even if it meant operating under fire. This was the birth of the mobile base support concept that would be essential for the invasion of France. The ammunition supply became a critical problem. The muddy roads slowed the trucks, and the Germans shelled the supply routes with accurate artillery fire. The ammunition companies had to work at night, under blackout conditions, to keep the forward dump stocked. The men learned to drive without headlights, guided by the dim glow of taillights and the distant flash of artillery. Maintenance in the field became a struggle against the elements as much as against mechanical failure. Rifles jammed with mud, machine guns froze, and tank engines overheated on the steep mountain grades. The ordnance men developed improvised solutions: canvas covers for weapons, portable stoves for warming engines, and extra cleaning kits issued to every infantryman. There was never enough cleaning and preserving material. By December, the Fifth Army was stalled along the winter line, a series of German fortifications anchored on Monte Cassino. The advance had cost thousands of casualties and hundreds of vehicles. The ordnance group had done its job, but the strain was showing. The men were exhausted, the spare parts were running low, and the winter had barely begun. The ammunition shortages forced a halt in the advance. The commanders could not push forward without shells, and the ordnance officers could not produce shells from empty depots. The supply line from Naples to the front was a fragile thread stretched across the mountains between the Volturno River and Cassino. The trucks wore out, the drivers exhausted. The famine was a logistical crisis 3 years in the making. Meanwhile in England, Henry B. Saylor, who had overseen the ordnance build-up for Overlord, remained in command of the European Theatre Ordnance Section through the final campaigns, and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his work in supplying the Allied advance across France and into Germany. The vehicle assembly program was a feat of industrial organization. Crated trucks arrived at the ports in a steady stream and were sent to assembly plants across the Midlands. The twin-unit pack system saved shipping space, but it required careful tracking to ensure that cabs, chassis, and axles arrived together. The ordnance depot companies worked with the British civilian assembly teams to keep the production lines moving. New methods of supply were developed for the invasion. The concept of the beach maintenance area was born, a strip of land behind the invasion beaches where ordnance units would set up temporary dumps and repair shops. Everything had to be portable, and everything had to be able to move inland quickly once the beachhead was secure. The lessons of North Africa and Sicily were being applied. The motor vehicle parks swelled with thousands of trucks, jeeps, and ambulances. They were parked in fields and on race courses, covered with camouflage netting to hide them from German reconnaissance aircraft. The vehicle parks became cities of canvas and steel, with their own roads, repair shops, and fuel depots. The ordnance troops lived in tents and worked in the mud, preparing for the largest amphibious operation in history. Waterproofing was a critical concern. Every vehicle that would roll off a landing craft onto a beach had to be sealed against salt water. The ordnance workshops applied rubber compounds to ignition systems, extended exhaust pipes with metal tubes, and covered air intakes with waterproof covers. The work was tedious and exacting, but the experience of Sicily and Salerno had shown that waterproofing could mean the difference between a working vehicle and a stranded hulk. The ammunition depots in England swelled with shells, bombs, and small arms ammunition. The roadside storage methods developed by the British were adopted and expanded. Hutments lined the country lanes, each stack carefully labelled and inventoried. The ammunition companies worked through the winter rains, moving thousands of tons of explosives from the ports to the depots. The stockpiles grew week by week. On the 22nd of January 1944, Allied forces landed at Anzio, 30 miles south of Rome. The landing was a bold attempt to outflank the German defences and open the road to the capital. The ordnance support for the assault was based on the lessons of Salerno. Beach groups were organised in advance, ammunition was loaded on Duquas and landing craft, and maintenance teams went ashore with the first waves. The ammunition dumps at Anzio were established under constant German air attack. The Luftwaffe had airfields within easy range, and they bombed the beachhead every night. The ordnance men worked in the dark, stacking shells and cartridges in shallow pits, covering them with sand and netting. Fires were a constant threat, and the men had to be ready to move the ammunition at a moment's notice. The beachhead was only 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and everything was within range of German artillery. The 88mm shells fell without warning, and the ordnance dumps took direct hits. The men learned to spread the stocks thin, digging smaller pits, and keeping the ammunition moving forward as fast as it came ashore. The supply line from Naples was long and vulnerable. The maintenance teams at Anzio set up shop in the cellars of bombed-out farmhouses and under the trees of the olive groves. Tanks and trucks that had been damaged in the landing or hit by shell fire were repaired in the field. The work was dangerous, with shells falling and aircraft strafing, but the men kept the vehicles running. The Sherman tanks of the 1st Armored Division pushed out from the beachhead and were met by German armor. The Germans surrounded the beachhead with artillery, including some of the largest guns in their arsenal. The Allies were trapped on a narrow strip of coast, and every ship that came into the anchorage was shelled. The ordnance supply officers had to calculate their requirements carefully, balancing the need for ammunition against the limited capacity of the landing craft. It was a logistical bottleneck of the worst kind. Through February and into March, the beachhead held. The German artillery continued to hammer the supply dumps, and the ordnance men continued to work under fire. The ammunition was moved at night, in small loads to avoid attracting the enemy guns. The maintenance teams repaired what they could and cannibalized what they could not. The beachhead became a test of endurance for every man and every piece of equipment. The German railway gun that the Allies called Anzio Annie began to shell the beachhead in early February. It was a 280mm gun mounted on a rail carriage, firing a 600-pound shell from a tunnel in the Alban Hills. The gun was invisible to the Allied artillery observers, and its shells arrived without warning. The men on the beachhead called it the Anzio Express. The shell from Anzio Annie was massive. It could penetrate 6 feet of concrete and leave a crater the size of a swimming pool. The ordnance dumps were particularly vulnerable, and the gun crews targeted the ammunition areas with precision. The men learned to listen for the distinctive whistle of the incoming round, and they scattered when they heard it. The gun was demoralizing, and it had to be silenced. The only answer was counter-battery fire from the heaviest American artillery. The 240mm howitzer M1 was shipped to Italy in response. This was a massive weapon, weighing nearly 65,000 pounds, firing a 360-pound high-explosive projectile to a range of over 25,000 yards. It was the largest field piece in the American arsenal. The 240mm howitzer was a weapon of siege warfare. It had been designed for breaking fortifications, not for counter-battery fire against a moving railway gun. But it was the only American gun that could reach the tunnels where Anzio Annie was hidden. The howitzers were emplaced in the hills behind the beachhead, their crews working day and night to prepare the firing positions. The 240mm shells were almost 4 feet long and weighed as much as a small car. Each round had to be handled with care, lifted by crane onto the loading tray and rammed into the breech by a hydraulic rammer. The gun crew could fire 1 round every 2 minutes, and each round was a statement of intent. The ground shook when the gun fired, and the smoke hung in the air for minutes afterward. The duel between the 240mm howitzers and Anzio Annie continued for weeks. The American gunners fired at the tunnel entrances, trying to collapse them. The German gunners fired back, trying to hit the howitzer positions. Neither side succeeded in silencing the other, but the American shells forced the Germans to move the railway gun frequently, reducing its rate of fire. The crisis was contained. The experience at Anzio drove home the need for a balanced artillery firepower concept. The army needed not just medium artillery for general support, but heavy guns for counter-battery and long-range interdiction. The 155mm gun, the 8-inch howitzer, and the 240mm howitzer were all part of the answer. The Ordnance Department began to prioritize the production and deployment of these heavy pieces. March brought no relief to the Italian front. The Germans held the high ground, and the Allies were stuck in the mud. The ordnance supply line stretched from Naples through the mountains, a journey of 150 miles over roads that were little more than tracks. Every gallon of gasoline and every round of ammunition had to travel that route, and the trucks wore out fast. The maintenance burden was enormous. The Ordnance Group in Italy continued to refine its organization. The battalions were rotated between the forward areas and the rear depots to give the men some rest. The heavy maintenance companies set up base shops in Naples, where they could rebuild engines and transmissions. The medium maintenance companies stayed closer to the front, providing quick repairs and replacement parts. The system worked, but just barely. The bomb disposal school in England was training men for the hazards they would face on the Normandy beaches. The Germans had planted millions of mines along the French coast, and they had fitted many of their artillery shells with delayed action fuses. The bomb disposal teams would have to clear the beaches under fire, and their training was intense. The Ordnance School at Tidworth taught the techniques of mine clearance and demolition. The preparations for Normandy involved every ordnance unit in England. The depots were filled to capacity, and the vehicle parks stretched for miles. The ammunition dumps held 30 days of supply for the initial assault. The waterproofing shops worked around the clock. Every vehicle that would go ashore on D-Day had to be treated, and there were thousands of them. The schedule was relentless. The balanced artillery firepower concept was developed into a formal doctrine in the spring of 1944. The army would land with a mix of light, medium, and heavy artillery, carefully calibrated to the expected resistance. The 105mm howitzer would provide close support for the infantry. The 155mm howitzer would engage targets at longer range. The 240mm howitzer and the 8-inch gun would deal with the heaviest fortifications. The 8-inch gun was another heavy piece that saw service in Italy. It fired a 240-pound projectile to a range of over 30,000 yards. It was used for counter-battery fire against German guns that were shelling the Allied lines. The 8-inch gun was mounted on the same carriage as the 240mm howitzer, which simplified production and maintenance. The two weapons were often deployed together. The ordnance battles with mud and craters in Italy continued through April. The spring rains turned the roads into quagmires, and the trucks struggled to reach the forward units. The engineers laid steel matting on the worst stretches, but the matting shifted and buckled under the weight of the heavy trucks. The ordnance maintenance teams worked in the muck, replacing tires and axles, patching radiators and fuel tanks. The supply system was under constant pressure. The ammunition expenditure was high, and the replacements for damaged vehicles were slow to arrive. The ordnance staff in Naples worked with the port authorities to prioritize the unloading of ordnance supplies. Every ship that docked carried something essential, and the unloading had to be efficient. The men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. The German artillery remained a deadly threat. The 88mm guns were accurate and well camouflaged, and they could hit targets at ranges that surprised the American gunners. The counter-battery fire from the 155mm and 8-inch guns helped to suppress the German batteries. But the enemy was skilled at moving his guns and avoiding detection. The artillery duel continued day and night. By the end of April, the Ordnance Group in Italy had settled into a routine. The supply lines were functioning, the maintenance shops were operating at capacity, and the ammunition dumps were stocked. The men were tired, but they knew their job. The Fifth Army was preparing for a major offensive, codenamed Diadem, that would break through the German defenses and open the road to Rome. The ordnance plan for Neptune, the naval component of Overlord, was finalized in the spring of 1944. The plan called for a massive logistical effort, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, and tens of thousands of ordnance troops. The beach maintenance areas were carefully planned, with designated locations for ammunition dumps, vehicle parks, and repair shops. The waterproofing program for Neptune was the largest ever attempted. Every vehicle that would land on D-Day was treated, from the jeeps to the 33-ton Sherman tanks. The Ordnance workshops applied the sealants and fitted the fording stacks with precision. The vehicles were tested in artificial ponds to ensure that they could operate in 3 feet of water. The failure rate had to be zero. The vehicle assembly lines in England were running at full capacity. Thousands of trucks, half-tracks, and armoured cars were assembled, tested, and driven to the vehicle parks. The Ordnance depot companies worked alongside the British civilian assemblers, checking each vehicle for defects and ensuring that the toolkits were complete. The vehicles were then staged in the marshalling areas, ready for loading onto the landing ships. The ammunition supply for Neptune was planned with meticulous care. Each unit was allotted a specific number of rounds for each weapon. The ammunition was packed in waterproof containers and loaded onto the ships in the order it would be needed. The forward dumps on the beach would hold 3 days of supply, and the rear dumps in England would hold 30 days. The system was designed to prevent the shortages that had plagued the earlier campaigns. The Ordnance troops for Neptune were organized into beach groups, each with a specific sector of the beach to support. The beach groups included maintenance teams, ammunition handlers, and supply personnel. They were trained in amphibious operations and equipped with the tools and vehicles they would need to establish the beach dumps. The training was realistic, conducted on the English coast under simulated combat conditions. The Ordnance plan also included provisions for the rapid expansion of the beachhead. Once the initial assault was secure, additional Ordnance units would come ashore to establish the rear depots and supply lines. The plan allowed for the flow of supplies to increase steadily as the port capacity grew. The Mulberry artificial harbours would play a key role in this expansion, providing sheltered water for unloading the cargo ships. On the 11th of May, Operation Diadem began in Italy. The Allied artillery opened fire along the entire front, from Cassino to the Tyrrhenian Sea. The bombardment was the heaviest of the Italian campaign, with every gun in the 5th and 8th Armies firing in sequence. The 240mm howitzers and the 8-inch guns fired at the German fortifications, trying to create gaps for the infantry. The 240mm howitzer fired its massive shells into the German lines. The 360-pound projectiles crashed into the mountain slopes, throwing up fountains of earth and rock. The gun crews worked in a rhythm of loading and firing, their ears protected by heavy muffs, their bodies moving with the practiced economy of experienced artillerymen. The ground shook with each round. The German defenders were stunned by the weight of the bombardment. The 240mm shells destroyed bunkers that had withstood weeks of bombing. The 155mm howitzers cut the barbed wire and suppressed the machine gun nests. The 105mm howitzers provided close support for the advancing infantry. The artillery plan was working. The advance was slow and costly. The Germans fought for every ridge and every village. The Ordnance contact parties moved with the forward battalions, repairing weapons and replacing vehicles under fire. The supply lines stretched through the mountains, and the trucks worked day and night to keep the ammunition coming. The expenditure of artillery shells was enormous, and the Ordnance staff had to calculate the requirements carefully. The ammunition supply for Diadem was the largest of the Italian campaign. The forward dumps held 1,000 rounds per gun, and the rear dumps held twice that. The trucks brought the shells from Naples, through the winding mountain roads to the gun positions. The Ordnance men worked around the clock, unloading the trucks and stacking the shells. There was never enough time, but the guns never fell silent. The German defences began to crack on the 18th of May when Polish troops captured Monte Cassino. The Allies pursued the retreating Germans northward. The Fifth Army advanced up the coast, and the Eighth Army pushed through the mountains. The breakthrough was the result of the artillery preparation and the courage of the infantry. The Ordnance support had been essential. The German defenders were not defeated. They withdrew to the next defensive line, the Caesar Line, which ran across the Italian peninsula south of Rome. The Allies had to regroup and bring up their supplies before they could continue the advance. The Ordnance units moved forward, establishing new dumps and repair shops in the captured territory. The pursuit was exhausting, but the men could sense that the end was near. By the end of May, the Fifth Army had broken through the Caesar Line and was advancing on Rome. The German resistance was crumbling. The Ordnance contact parties rode with the forward elements, keeping the tanks and trucks running. The supply line was stretched thin, but the men made it work. They had learned the lessons of North Africa and Sicily, and they applied them in the Italian hills. The Allies entered Rome on the 4th of June 1944. The city was undamaged, and the people welcomed the liberators with cheers and flowers. The ordnance officers who entered the city with the forward troops saw a vision of what Europe could be, a continent freed from the grip of the Axis. But the war was not over. The German army was retreating northward, and the Allies would have to pursue it. In the Vatican and the ancient squares, the American soldiers were greeted as heroes. The ordnance men who had fought through the mud and the rain and the shellfire allowed themselves a moment of pride. They had kept the guns firing and the tanks rolling. They had done their job. The ordnance lessons of the Mediterranean campaigns were collected and analyzed in the spring of 1944. The Provisional Ordnance Group had been validated and adopted as standard doctrine. The need for tank transporters was fully accepted. The value of the DOKW in amphibious operations was proven. The requirement for heavy artillery for counter-battery fire was clear. The balanced artillery firepower concept was written into the field manuals. The Army would deploy a mix of light, medium, and heavy artillery, carefully calibrated to the expected resistance. The 105mm howitzer, the 155mm howitzer, the 155mm gun, the 8-inch howitzer, and the 240mm howitzer would all have their roles. The Ordnance Department had learned the lessons of Anzio. The development of the M26 Pershing heavy tank was accelerated. The German Panther and Tiger tanks had proven superior to the Sherman in armor and firepower. The Pershing would mount a 90mm gun based on the anti-aircraft gun that had been adapted for anti-tank use. Production was still in the future, and the tank would not be ready in time for the Italian campaign. The tank transporter program was expanded. The heavy transporters that had been so desperately needed in Tunisia were now rolling off American assembly lines in quantity. They would be waiting in England when the invasion of Normandy began. The lesson of the mud at Medjez el Bab had been learned. The ordnance support for the invasion of Normandy was the most carefully planned logistical operation in history. Every detail had been considered: the waterproofing, the vehicle assembly, the ammunition supply, the beach maintenance areas. The Ordnance Department had learned from every mistake and every success of the Mediterranean campaigns. The invasion force would be the best equipped fighting force ever sent into battle. On the 5th of June 1944, the eve of the invasion, the Allied forces were ready. The ships were loaded, the troops were briefed, and the weather was marginal. Eisenhower made the decision to go. The ordnance troops in the marshalling areas checked their equipment one last time. They knew that the next day would be the culmination of everything they had learned in Africa and Sicily and Italy. The men of the Ordnance Department who would land on the Normandy beaches were veterans of the Mediterranean campaigns. They had learned their trade in the hard school of combat. They knew how to establish a beach dump under fire, how to repair a tank in the mud, how to keep the ammunition moving forward. They were ready. The ships weighed anchor and formed into convoys. The English coast faded into the mist, and the Armada headed south. The men on the decks could see the vast fleet stretching to the horizon: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing ships, and cargo vessels. It was the largest invasion fleet in history, and the Ordnance Department had supplied its guns and its vehicles and its ammunition. The ordnance plan for Neptune was comprehensive, but no plan survives contact with the enemy. The men who would land on Omaha and Utah beaches knew that they would have to improvise, adapt, and overcome. They had done it before in North Africa and Sicily and Italy. They would do it again. The men in the landing craft checked their weapons and their equipment one last time. The waterproofing on the vehicles had been applied with care, and the fording stacks were secured. The Dooku's bobbed in the waves, loaded with ammunition and supplies. The beach maintenance teams were organized and ready. The first waves of the assault would go in at dawn. The infantry would secure the beaches, and the ordnance would follow. The army that landed in Normandy would not be the same army that had landed in North Africa. It was better equipped, better trained, and better supported. The Ordnance Department had done its job. In the command ship off the coast of Normandy, the final briefings were conducted. The ordnance officers studied the maps of the beaches, identifying the exits and the assembly areas. They knew that the first few hours would be critical. The success of the invasion depended on getting the vehicles and the ammunition ashore quickly. The plan was sound, but the enemy was waiting. The men who would land on the beaches carried the weight of the past 3 years of war. They had seen comrades killed, equipment lost, and plans go wrong. But they had also seen the army learn from its mistakes. They had seen the Ordnance Department adapt and improve. They had seen the invasion force grow stronger with each campaign. The night of the 5th of June was clear and cool. The men slept in their landing craft or stood on the decks, watching the stars. Some wrote letters home, others cleaned their weapons for the 100th time. The invasion of Normandy would be the largest and most complex amphibious operation in history, and the Ordnance Department would be tested as never before. The ordnance officers in the command ships reviewed the final reports. The vehicle parks in England were empty. The ammunition depots were stocked to capacity. The waterproofing had been applied to every vehicle. The men were ready. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, the ordnance staff in England had worked around the clock. The supply lists were checked and rechecked. The shipping manifests were verified. The vehicle parks were inspected. Every detail had been attended to. The invasion force was as ready as it could be. The invasion fleet was ready. The beach groups would go ashore with the first waves, carrying tools and spare parts instead of rifles. The maintenance teams would follow close behind, and the supply depots would be established in the days after the landing. The men checked their equipment one last time in the marshalling areas. The plan was sound, and the Ordnance Department had learned from every campaign that came before. The ships sailed through the night toward the coast of France. The men on the decks watched the horizon, waiting for the first light of dawn. Behind them lay England, the base that had been built over 2 years of preparation. Ahead lay the beaches of Normandy and the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The Ordnance Department had done its job. The invasion fleet crossed the English Channel on the night of the 5th. The ships stretched across the dark water, loaded with men and vehicles and ammunition crates. The ordnance beach groups were packed into the landing craft, carrying tools and spare parts instead of rifles. Dawn broke grey and smoky over the coast of France. The ramps dropped on Omaha and Utah beaches. The first waves of tanks lurched into the surf and foundered in the deeper channels. The waterproofing held on most engines, but many vehicles swamped and sank. Ordnance men waded ashore through bullet-torn water, dragging tow cables behind them. They reached the sand and began marking exit routes through the minefields. The beach was a chaos of burning trucks and fallen men. The beachmaster shouted orders over the crash of German artillery. Machine guns swept the shoreline from the bluffs above. Medics and ordnance men worked side by side, hauling wounded soldiers behind disabled vehicles. The tanks that reached the shingle climbed the bank and returned fire from the higher ground. By mid-morning, a few narrow gaps appeared in the German defences. The first ammunition dumps took shape above the high-water line. Men dug shallow pits in the sand and stacked shells and grenade boxes in neat rows. The ordnance beach parties marked each pile with whatever paint they carried. Graves registration teams moved among the debris, and the supply of the invasion began. The beach maintenance area was being borne under fire. Colonel John B. Madaris waded ashore in the late morning. His job was to make the beach maintenance area function under combat conditions. He found the exits clogged with wrecked vehicles and abandoned equipment. The engineers were already bulldozing paths through the shingle and the sand. Madaris began directing the flow of trucks into the assembly areas behind the dunes. The beach maintenance area held the forward dumps, the vehicle parks, and the light repair shops. Madaris sent his men to clear space for the heavy wreckers and the spare parts pallets. By evening, the first replacement weapons were being issued to depleted units. The Ordnance Service Centre concept, proven in Australia and Italy, had crossed the channel behind the assault waves. The system was working. The next morning, Madaris ordered the exits widened. The tide had gone out, leaving a line of broken landing craft and drowned vehicles on the sand. Rhino ferries began arriving offshore, their pontoon decks loaded with trucks and artillery pieces. Each rhino was a floating bridge section, towed by a tug and beached at the water's edge. The vehicles drove off the ramps and straight into the waiting columns. The rhino ferries were a new tool for the ordnance beach groups. They had been developed specifically for the Normandy beaches, where the gradient was shallow and the LSTs could not ground close enough. Each ferry carried a dozen trucks or 4 medium tanks. The ordnance men had trained with them in England for several weeks. The system was grinding and slow, but it was continuous. Madaris stood at the waterline, watching the vehicles splash ashore. Behind him, The dumps grew larger with each passing hour. Ahead of him, the infantry was fighting through the bocage country. The hedgerows were the new problem, and they were unlike anything the planners had anticipated. Each field was a fortress, ringed with dirt banks and thick brush. Madaris would later serve as chief of Ordnance, commanding the army's missile programs during the Cold War. The tank commanders could not push through the dense hedgerows. The Sherman's belly was exposed when it crested the bank, and the German anti-tank gunners waited on the far side. The infantry had no cover in the open fields. Ordnance welding teams began experimenting with steel rails pulled from German beach obstacles. They welded the rails onto the fronts of the tanks in crude prongs. The hedgerow cutter was an expedient born of necessity. A tank would drive its nose into the bank, and the prongs would bite into the earth. The driver would throttle forward, tearing a gap wide enough for the infantry to follow. The first cutters were fabricated on the beach itself by ordnance welders, working through the night. By the third week, the beach maintenance shops were producing them in quantity. The tanks rolled forward, chewing through the hedgerows one field at a time. The infantry pushed through the gaps and cleared the German positions. The breakout was slow, but it was steady. Ordnance recovery teams followed close behind, towing damaged tanks to the repair points. The hedgerow cutter had solved the tactical problem of the bocage. Operation Cobra began on the 25th of July. The heavy bombers hit the German lines west of St. Lo, and the armor poured through the gap in the front. Third Army was activated under General Patton, and the race across France began. Ordnance units packed their portable shops and followed close behind the tank columns. The mobile base support concept, tested in Italy, was now essential. The supply lines stretched immediately. Each ordnance battalion established a forward dump every 50 miles, leapfrogging ahead as the armor advanced. The depots in the beach maintenance areas fed the forward dumps by truck convoy. The men worked around the clock, loading ammunition and spare parts for the next bound. The speed of the advance was unprecedented. The Brittany campaign was the first major test of the mobile supply system. Ordnance convoys rolled south and west, establishing forward dumps on the move. The tank transporters, so desperately needed in Tunisia, now carried Sherman tanks from the ports to the front at highway speed. The heavy transporters had finally arrived in quantity. The ports of Brittany fell one after another. Ordnance beach groups shifted their operations to the captured harbours. Cherbourg was already open, and the flow of supplies increased steadily. But the front was moving faster than the supply lines could stretch. Every shell and every gallon of fuel had to be trucked from the beaches. The depots in the rear could not keep up with the demand. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. The crowds lined the streets, and the ordnance convoys drove through the city with the infantry columns. The celebration was loud and joyful, but behind the cheering, the supply officers were calculating numbers. The distance from the beaches to the front was now more than 300 miles. The supply famine began in earnest during September. The depots at Cherbourg and the Brittany ports were stacked to capacity, but the trucks could not carry enough tonnage forward. Ammunition was the critical item in short supply. The artillery batteries at the Siegfried Line were firing at reduced rates. The ordnance officers sent desperate messages for more trucks and more drivers. First Army reached the German border and faced the Siegfried Line. The fortifications were a belt of concrete pillboxes and steel tank traps stretching across the frontier. The infantry needed artillery support to crack the defenses, but the shells were not arriving fast enough to sustain a sustained bombardment. Every ordnance company was working double shifts, loading and unloading at the railheads. The Ninth Army faced its own challenges in the north. The port of Antwerp was captured intact, but the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands. The channel was blocked, and no ships could reach the docks. Every shell for Ninth Army had to come overland from the Normandy beaches, a round trip of nearly 1,000 miles. The ordnance officers in Ninth Army organized their own supply convoys. They used every available truck, including the wreckers and the shop vans. The men drove through the night with their headlights off, navigating by compass and the white stripe painted on the tailgate of the truck ahead. The shells arrived in the forward dumps by the truckload. Never enough, but always just enough. The Roer River offensive began in the cold, wet weather of November. The ground was saturated, and the tanks struggled to move in the mud. The German Panther tanks, with their long 75mm guns, outranged the Sherman tanks. The tank duels on the raw plain were brutal and one-sided. Ordnance recovery crews worked under artillery fire to tow damaged Shermans to the rear. The ordnance units in the field worked to keep the Shermans running. They replaced tracks and engines in the forward assembly areas, under sporadic shell fire. The M36 tank destroyers, mounting the new 90mm gun, began arriving at the front in small numbers. The 90mm could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at 1,000 yards. The balance of firepower was shifting. The Zebra mission was preparing in the rear depots. The M26 Pershing tank, armed with a 90mm gun, had been developed in response to the German heavy tanks. 20 Pershings were shipped to Europe in the winter. They were assigned to First Army, but they had not yet reached the forward units. The tank transporters carried them inland from the ports. The Battle of the Bulge began on the 16th of December. German armored divisions broke through the Ardennes, and the American supply lines were severed in the first hours. The forward ammunition dumps were overrun or abandoned. The ordnance units in the path of the attack burned their stores and retreated toward the rear. The surprise was complete. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. The ordnance units inside the perimeter fought alongside the infantry, holding the roads. The ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per gun per day. The repair shops worked in damp cellars, patching tanks with salvaged parts. The men who had landed on the beaches 6 months earlier were now fighting a siege in the snow. Third Army turned north and drove toward Bastogne through the frozen Ardennes. The ordnance convoys followed the armor through the snow-covered roads. The temperature dropped below zero, and the men worked in numbing cold, changing tank tracks and refueling vehicles in the open fields. The relief of Bastogne came on the 26th of December. The perimeter held. The Ardennes campaign taught hard lessons about American tank design. The Sherman was outgunned by the German Panther and Tiger tanks at normal combat ranges. The need for heavier armor and a more powerful gun was now urgent and undeniable. The Ordnance Department in Washington accelerated the deployment of the Pershing tank. The first 20 were already in Europe. The M26 Pershing tanks were assigned to the Zebra mission, a special detachment within First Army. The Pershing weighed 46 tons and mounted a 90mm gun. It was the first American tank that could match the Panther in both armor and firepower. The crews trained on the new vehicles in the rear areas, learning the maintenance procedures. The Pershings were ready for action. The Pershings went into combat in the final weeks of the war in Europe. They proved themselves in the tank duels along the Roer and the Rhine rivers. The 90mm gun knocked out the German Panthers at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm had bounced off the armor. The ordnance men who had maintained the Shermans for 3 years finally had a tank that could fight on equal terms. The Remagen Bridge was captured on the 7th of March. The Ludendorff Bridge spanned the Rhine, and the Americans poured across before the Germans could demolish it. Ordnance units followed immediately, establishing forward dumps on the east bank of the river. The supply lines shortened as the armies drove deeper into Germany. The beach maintenance area was now a distant memory. The Ordnance technical intelligence teams moved with the forward troops through Germany. They collected German weapons and equipment for shipment to the proving grounds in the United States. Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, assault rifles, and rocket launchers were loaded onto railroad cars. The engineers studied the designs and the metallurgy. The intelligence gained would shape post-war American weapons. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May. The ordnance units in Germany began the enormous task of reclamation. They collected the equipment of the defeated German army, sorted it, and prepared it for disposal. The surplus trucks and tanks were driven to collection points across the countryside. The ammunition was stockpiled for demolition or shipment back to the depots. The ordnance beach groups on the Normandy coast packed their tools and closed their shops for the last time. The depots in France were emptied or transferred to the occupation forces. The great logistical machine that had sustained the armies from Omaha Beach to the Elbe River was winding down. The men who had landed on the beaches in June 1944 were going home. The Ordnance Department had kept the armies supplied across 3,000 miles of ocean and 600 miles of contested ground. The hedgerow cutter, the 90mm gun, the M26 Pershing, the tank transporter, the DUKW, and the beach maintenance area were all products of a system that learned from its failures. The war in Europe was won by the fighting men. The Ordnance Department made sure they had the tools to fight. But that climax in Europe had been preceded by a long, grinding war in the Pacific. By January of 1943, the Papua campaign was finally over. The Japanese had been driven from Buna, but the cost had been severe. Ordnance officers on the ground understood that the jungle had exposed deep weaknesses in their system. Weapons had rusted in the humidity. Ammunition had been lost in coastal disasters. The lessons were painfully clear, and they would have to be applied quickly. The first lesson was about transportation. The disaster off Cape Sudeste had proven that small trawlers could not sustain a modern army. Supply by air was too unreliable in bad weather. The answer was to build forward bases with real port facilities. At Oro Bay and Milne Bay, the expansion began in earnest. Bulldozers carved roads out of the jungle. Engineers drove pilings into the mud for new wharves. Ordnance depots rose on ground that had been swamp only weeks before. The second lesson was about maintenance in wet climates. The standard cleaning and preserving materials had failed completely in the field. Gun oil turned to sludge in the heat. Metal parts corroded within days. Ordnance teams in Australia began experimenting with new lubricants. They developed a lanolin-based compound that resisted moisture far better than the standard issue. By the spring of 1943, this new preservative was being shipped to every forward unit in the theatre. The third lesson was about personnel. The campaign had been fought with too few ordnance troops, spread across too many isolated posts. Port Moresby had operated with 650 men to support an entire division. The men worked 7 days a week in oppressive heat, often on half rations. Requests for reinforcements had been repeatedly denied. Now the commanders in Washington finally understood the scale of the need. New ordnance units were allocated for the Pacific, including depot companies and heavy maintenance battalions. The fourth lesson was about weapons suitable for the jungle. The standard infantry rifle and machine gun were adequate, but the lack of a lightweight automatic weapon was glaring. The Thompson submachine gun was popular, but consumed ammunition at a reckless rate. The Browning automatic rifle was too heavy for rapid movement through the bush. The carbine, which had been requested before the campaign, was still not arriving in sufficient numbers. Ordnance officers pressed Washington for more compact and reliable weapons. The expansion at Oro Bay and Milne Bay moved forward through the spring of 1943. At Oro Bay, the harbour was dredged to accept deeper draft vessels. Ordnance established a general supply depot with 50,000 square feet of covered storage. A separate ammunition area was carved into the hillsides, with revetments to protect against bomb blast. The maintenance shop was housed in a former coconut warehouse. It had concrete floors and enough space for 20 trucks at a time. At Milne Bay, the build-up was even more ambitious. The anchorage was deep and sheltered, ideal for a major base. Ordnance built a vehicle park, capable of holding 500 trucks. A heavy maintenance plant was constructed from prefabricated steel sections shipped from Australia. The plant could rebuild engines and transmissions that had been destroyed by the jungle mud. A tire retreading facility was added, since rubber was in critically short supply across the theatre. The service centre concept that had been pioneered at Geelong was now applied to these forward bases. Instead of having depot, maintenance and ammunition units scattered across the base, they were grouped in a single area under ordnance control. This allowed the base ordnance officer to shift resources quickly as the workload changed. It also simplified the problem of feeding and housing the troops. The model proved so effective that it was adopted as standard procedure throughout the Southwest Pacific. The new bases required a steady flow of supplies from Australia. Port operations at Brisbane and Townsville were reorganised to handle the increased volume. Ordnance officers at the ports learned to identify and segregate cargo before it reached the docks. Ships were loaded with complete unit sets whenever possible. The practice of loading chassis on one vessel and cabs on another was finally abandoned. The time lost in matching components on the far shore was simply too expensive. The motor vehicle situation in the theatre was improving. The transfer from quartermaster to ordnance had been chaotic at first, but by the spring of 1943, the system was beginning to work. Spare parts were arriving in larger quantities. The assembly plants at Brisbane and Townsville were processing crated vehicles at full capacity. The modified Jeep with dual rear wheels, developed during the Papua campaign, was now being produced in Australia and shipped forward in significant numbers. New weapons for jungle warfare were finally reaching the theatre by the middle of 1943. The first shipments of the M1 carbine arrived and were distributed to frontline units. The carbine was lighter than the Garand rifle and easier to handle in close quarters fighting. Its 30 caliber round was less powerful than the rifle round, but for jungle patrols the trade-off was acceptable. The men appreciated the reduced weight, especially during long patrols through the mountains. A more significant arrival was the 75mm pack howitzer, designed to be broken down into mule loads for transport over rough terrain. The standard 105mm howitzer was too heavy for the jungle trails. The pack howitzer could be dismantled into 9 loads, each weighing under 200 pounds. It could be reassembled in 15 minutes and put into action. This weapon gave the infantry direct fire support in areas where wheeled artillery could not go. The Ordnance Department also introduced a new version of the 60mm mortar with an improved bipod and sight. The mortar had proven itself as the most responsive indirect fire weapon in the jungle. The new model was more accurate and could sustain a higher rate of fire. Fragmentation bombs for air support were redesigned with a quick fuzzing mechanism that detonated on contact with foliage. This eliminated the problem of bombs burying themselves in the swamp before exploding. Cleaning and preserving materials remained a persistent challenge. The new lanolin compound was effective, but it was not available in sufficient quantities. The standard-issue oil containers were too small for field use. Ordnance workshops in Australia began manufacturing 2-ounce plastic containers that could be carried in a pocket. These were issued to every rifleman. The supply of cleaning patches and bore brushes was also increased, based on the expenditure rates observed in the Papua fighting. The Ordnance technical intelligence effort expanded during this period. Captured Japanese weapons were collected from the battlefields and sent to Australia for evaluation. The Japanese Arisaka rifle was studied for its metallurgical properties. The Nambu light machine gun was tested for rate of fire and reliability. Reports were compiled on Japanese mortar design and fuzzing mechanisms. This information was shared with the other theaters through the Ordnance Department's technical channels. The operations in the Admiralty Islands began in September of 1943. The objective was to secure the anchorage at Seydla Harbour, which would provide a forward base for the leap toward the Philippines. Ordnance support for the operation was codenamed Brewer. The plan called for a small force of ordnance troops to accompany the assault elements and establish a beach maintenance area immediately after the landing. The landing at Los Negros Island was preceded by a heavy naval bombardment. The Ordnance detachment went ashore on the first day with the infantry. The beach was narrow, and the sand was soft, making vehicle movement difficult. The men unloaded ammunition crates by hand and stacked them behind a coconut log revetment. There was no time to build proper shelters. The troops worked under sporadic sniper fire for the first 48 hours. The Japanese garrison on Manus Island resisted fiercely. The fighting continued for nearly 2 weeks. Ordnance maintenance teams moved forward with the infantry, repairing weapons that had been damaged in the wet sand. The 37mm anti-tank guns were used against bunker positions with canister ammunition. The shotgun effect of the canister rounds proved devastating at short range, just as it had in Papua. The technique was now standard doctrine for jungle fighting. The seizure of Seydla Harbour was a major logistical achievement. The harbour was deep enough to accommodate ocean-going freighters. Ordnance established a depot on the northern shore with storage for 10,000 tons of ammunition. A vehicle park was built on the site of an abandoned coconut plantation. The maintenance shop was housed in a former Japanese warehouse that had survived the bombardment. The base at Manus became a critical staging point for the operations that followed. The Admiralty operation taught valuable lessons about amphibious supply. The beach maintenance area concept, which had been developed in the Mediterranean, was adapted for Pacific conditions. The key was to keep the beaches clear by moving supplies inland as quickly as possible. Ordnance troops used captured Japanese trucks to supplement their own vehicle fleet. The Japanese trucks were lighter than American models and could navigate the narrow trails more easily. The success at Manus allowed General MacArthur to accelerate his timetable. The next major objective was Hollandia, on the northern coast of New Guinea. The operation was planned for April of 1944. Hollandia was defended by a substantial Japanese garrison, but the real challenge was logistical. The base would have to be supplied entirely over the beach until the port facilities could be repaired. Ordnance planners prepared for a major effort. The Hollandia landings were the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific up to that time. 3 separate beachheads were established simultaneously. Ordnance depot barges were used for the first time in this operation. These were converted landing craft fitted with shelving and bins for small parts. They could be beached directly and unloaded without the need for dock facilities. The depot barges allowed Ordnance to establish a forward supply point within hours of the initial assault. The terrain at Hollandia was among the worst encountered in the war. The beaches were backed by steep, swampy ground that turned into a morass after a single day of rain. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Ordnance crews worked knee-deep in mud to unload ammunition from the depot barges. They used captured Japanese corduroy logs to build crude roads. By the third day, a workable supply route had been established to the forward positions. The I-tape landing, conducted simultaneously with Hollandia, was smaller but equally demanding. The beach was exposed to the open sea, and landing craft could approach only in calm weather. Ordnance troops established a dump behind a sand dune, using the natural contour of the land as protection. The supply of 81mm mortar ammunition was given the highest priority, since the mortars were the primary support weapon for the infantry in the swampy terrain. The depot barge concept proved so successful that it was expanded immediately. A standard LCM Mark III landing craft was fitted with a box-shaped superstructure containing storage racks and a workbench. The barge could carry a 60-day supply of spare parts for an infantry regiment. It also carried a stock of cleaning materials, tools, and replacement barrels for machine guns. The barge was manned by 6 ordnance soldiers who lived aboard and moved with the advance. The Hollandia Etape operation demonstrated the value of forward planning. The ammunition expenditure had been calculated in advance with reasonable accuracy. The supply of 105mm howitzer ammunition, which had been the critical shortage in Papua, was adequate throughout the campaign. The difference was that the base at Oro Bay had been built up to a capacity that allowed continuous resupply by ship. The lesson was that forward bases needed to be established well before the offensive began. The invasion of Biak followed in late May of 1944. Biak Island was located at the entrance to Gilvink Bay, a strategic position for controlling the approaches to the Philippines. The terrain was coral rock, not jungle swamp. This presented a completely different set of ordnance problems. The coral was so sharp that it cut through standard truck tires within hours of driving off the landing craft. The heat was intense, and there was no shade on the barren coral ridges. The Japanese defenders on Biak had prepared extensive cave positions. The fighting was slow and brutal. The 75mm pack howitzers were brought forward to fire directly into cave entrances. The 81mm mortars were used to place rounds on the reverse slopes of ridges where the howitzers could not reach. Ordnance teams struggled to keep the weapons firing. The coral dust clogged the action of every rifle and machine gun, requiring constant cleaning. The tire shortage on Biak became critical. The standard combat tire was simply not designed for the sharp coral surface. Ordnance improvised by fitting trucks with dual tires on the rear axle to distribute the weight over a larger area. This helped, but it did not solve the problem completely. A request was sent to Australia for a supply of heavy-duty tires with a deeper tread pattern. The response was slow, and the fighting on Biak was over before the new tires arrived. The Biak campaign lasted until August of 1944. It was one of the costliest operations of the Pacific War in terms of casualties. Ordnance units suffered their share of losses. The maintenance teams worked under fire, often within a few hundred yards of the front line. The recovery of damaged weapons was dangerous but essential, since the supply of replacement rifles and machine guns was limited. The troops learned to appreciate the value of proper maintenance under the most adverse conditions. The next operations were aimed at securing the Gilvink Bay area. Wakday Island was taken in a rapid assault. Nome 4 Island followed in July. The landings at Sansapor on the Vogelkop Peninsula were unopposed. These operations were smaller than Biak, but they required careful logistical coordination. Ordnance established a mobile supply point at each location, stocked with enough ammunition and spare parts to support the garrison for 30 days. The mobile supply point concept worked well. The Sansapor area became the final staging base before the leap to the Philippines. Ordnance built a substantial depot on the coast with covered storage for 10,000 tons of supplies. The depot included a vehicle park and a heavy maintenance shop capable of rebuilding engines. A water distillation plant was installed to provide fresh water for the troops. The base was protected by anti-aircraft batteries, but the Japanese Air Force had been so depleted by this stage of the war that attacks were rare. The Morotai landings in September of 1944 were the last major operation in the New Guinea campaign. Morotai was located at the northern end of the Molucca Islands, within striking distance of the southern Philippines. The landing was unopposed. Ordnance troops went ashore on the first day and established a dump on the beach. The main challenge was the mud. The monsoon rains had turned the entire island into a quagmire. Vehicles sank to their axles on the main road. The Morotai base was built with an urgency that reflected the pace of the advance. Construction crews worked around the clock. Ordnance erected a series of prefabricated steel warehouses on a ridge above the beach. The ammunition depot was located in a valley to the north, with each stack separated by a blast wall of sandbags. The vehicle park was built on a drained swamp, using a layer of crushed coral as a base. The mud remained a problem throughout the occupation. The supply line from Australia to Morotai was now over 2,000 miles long. The shipping requirements were enormous. Ordnance officers at Brisbane and Townsville worked with the Transportation Corps to schedule cargo vessels. The priority was always ammunition, followed by spare parts and then replacement weapons. The system of automatic supply, which had been developed in the early days of the war, was now functioning smoothly. The depots in Australia maintained a 60-day reserve for every item in the Ordnance catalogue. The final preparations for the invasion of the Philippines were now underway. General MacArthur had promised to return. The Ordnance Department would be responsible for supplying one of the largest amphibious operations in history. The plan called for the establishment of a major base on Leyte Island. Ordnance planners studied the lessons of every previous Pacific campaign. They designed a system of depot barges, beach maintenance areas, and forward supply points that could support a force of 200,000 men. The Leyte landings took place on the 20th of October 1944. The assault forces went ashore on the eastern coast of the island, near the town of Tacloban. Ordnance depot barges were beached alongside the infantry landing craft. The men unloaded ammunition and spare parts directly onto the sand. The Japanese Air Force reacted immediately. Bombers and fighters attacked the beachhead throughout the first day. The depot barges were vulnerable targets, but none were hit. The first week on Leyte was a battle against the weather as much as against the Japanese. The northeast monsoon had begun, and the rain fell in sheets. The ground turned to liquid mud. Vehicles could not move. Ordnance troops unloaded cargo by hand, stacking ammunition crates on pallets to keep them out of the water. The work went on through the night under blackout conditions. The men were exhausted, but they could not stop. The infantry needed ammunition to hold the beachhead. The Japanese launched a major air offensive against the Leyte beachhead in November. They targeted the ammunition dumps. On the night of the 11th of November, a raid struck the main ordnance depot near Tacloban. Fires broke out in 3 stacks of artillery ammunition. The explosions continued for hours. Approximately 30% of the ammunition stock on Leyte was destroyed. The loss was serious, but it was not catastrophic. The depot barges had dispersed the ammunition over a wide area, limiting the damage. The ordnance response to the ammunition loss was immediate. A priority shipment of replacement ammunition was dispatched from the base at Morotai. The ships arrived within 5 days. The depot was rebuilt at a new location, with wider spacing between stacks. Revetments were constructed from earth and coconut logs to contain any future explosions. The lesson of dispersal, learned at Anzio and reinforced at Leyte, was now standard procedure for every ammunition depot in the theatre. The 8th Army took over responsibility for Leyte in November. The ordnance units assigned to 8th Army arrived with their own equipment and supplies. The transfer was smooth. The base ordnance officer on Leyte coordinated with the incoming units to ensure continuity of support. The ammunition dumps were inventoried and turned over. The depot barges remained under the control of 6th Army, which was already preparing for the next major operation on Luzon. Mindoro Island was the next objective. The operation was launched in December of 1944. The landing was unopposed. Ordnance established a small base on the western coast, with a pier for unloading cargo ships. The airfield at Mindoro was captured intact and quickly expanded. The island became a staging base for the Luzon operation. Ordnance stockpiled ammunition and supplies on Mindoro, using the depot barge system to move the material from the beach to inland storage areas. The success on Mindoro was followed by a rapid consolidation of the Visayan passages. The Japanese Navy had been driven from the central Philippines. The sea lanes were now secure for the movement of supply ships. Ordnance convoys moved through the Visayan Sea without interference for the first time since the war began. The establishment of a secure line of communications was a turning point in the campaign. The supply situation improved dramatically. The invasion of Luzon commenced on the 9th of January 1945. The landings hit the beaches of Lingayen Gulf, on the western coast of the island. It was the biggest amphibious assault yet mounted in the Pacific. More than 200,000 troops were committed. Ordnance planners had spent 6 months preparing. The depot barges carried a full 60-day supply of ammunition and spare parts. The beach maintenance area was mapped out in advance. Everything was in place. The Lingayen landings were opposed by Japanese aircraft, but the naval bombardment had suppressed the coastal defenses. The first waves of troops went ashore at 9 o'clock in the morning. Ordnance depot barges followed within the hour. The beach was firm sand, good for vehicle movement. The depot barges were beached in a line, and the troops unloaded the cargo directly onto trucks. By the end of the first day, 10,000 tons of ordnance supplies had been brought ashore. The advance inland from Lingayen was rapid. General MacArthur's forces drove toward Manila. Ordnance support kept pace with the advance. Depot barges were moved forward along the coast as the front expanded. Truck convoys carried ammunition and spare parts from the beachhead to forward dumps established every 50 miles along the main highway. The system worked. The troops never lacked ammunition, and the vehicle loss rate was lower than in any previous Pacific campaign. The port of Manila was captured in early February. The harbor was in shambles. The Japanese had scuttled ships in the channel and destroyed the pier facilities. Ordnance engineers went to work immediately. They rigged temporary moorings for landing craft and established a beach maintenance area on the waterfront. The first cargo ship unloaded at Manila in mid-February. Within a month, the port was handling 5,000 tons of cargo per day. The supply base for the Luzon campaign was now secure. The advance into the central Luzon plain required the clearance of the Visayan passages, which were still held by Japanese forces in the southern islands. The operations to clear these passages began in February and continued through March. Ordnance supported these operations with depot barges that moved from island to island. The barges were loaded with ammunition and spare parts for the infantry regiments engaged in the clearing operations. The system proved highly effective in the complex inter-island environment. The invasion of Palawan took place in March of 1945. The island was strategically located for controlling the South China Sea. The landing was lightly opposed. Ordnance established a small base on the northern coast, with a pier for unloading cargo ships. The base at Palawan became a staging point for the operations in the southern Philippines. Ordnance stockpiled ammunition and supplies for the Mindanao campaign at this location. The Zamboanga landings on the southern tip of Mindanao followed in mid-March. The Japanese garrison was isolated and could not be reinforced. The fighting was limited. Ordnance support was provided by depot barges operating from Palawan. The barges carried a full range of supplies, from artillery shells to rifle cleaning kits. The troops were well supplied throughout the operation. The Zamboanga base was secured within 2 weeks. Mindanao, the largest island in the southern Philippines, was the final objective in the Philippine campaign. The landings took place in April of 1945. The Japanese forces on Mindanao were substantial, but they were cut off from reinforcement and resupply. Ordnance established a depot at Parang on the western coast and another at Davao on the eastern coast. The two depots supported the converging drives of the American forces. The supply lines were long, but the depot barge system made them manageable. The fighting on Mindanao continued into June. The Japanese had withdrawn into the mountains, where they had prepared strong defensive positions. The 105mm howitzer was the primary weapon used to reduce these positions. The howitzers were supplied by a continuous stream of cargo ships from the Leyte base. The ammunition expenditure was high, but the supply was adequate. The ordnance system, built over 3 years of hard experience, was working at peak efficiency. As the Philippines campaign reached its conclusion in the spring of 1945, plans were being completed for the next major objective, Okinawa, in the Ryukyu Islands, only 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. The island was heavily fortified, with a garrison of over 100,000 men. The invasion was scheduled for the 1st of April. Ordnance planners had been working on the supply plan for 6 months. The 10th Army was assigned the mission of capturing Okinawa. The commanding general, Simon Bolivar Buckner, had a clear understanding of the logistical requirements. He insisted that a full 60-day supply of ammunition be stockpiled before the invasion began. Ordnance established a forward base at Ulithi Atoll, where cargo ships were loaded with ammunition and supplies. The depot ships were designed to support the assault forces until the beach maintenance area was established on Okinawa. The Kerama-Retto Islands west of Okinawa were the first objective. The islands were seized on the 26th of March. They provided an anchorage for the supply fleet and a base for the repair of damaged ships. Ordnance established a small depot on Kerama-Retto with a pier for unloading cargo. The depot stocked ammunition for the naval bombardment forces and spare parts for the landing craft. The Kerama-Retto base was a model of efficient planning. The main landings on Okinawa took place on the 1st of April, Easter Sunday. The beaches at Hagushi were wide and gently sloping. The naval bombardment had suppressed the coastal defenses. The first waves of troops went ashore without opposition. Ordnance depot barges were beached alongside the infantry landing craft. The men unloaded ammunition and spare parts directly onto the sand. The beach maintenance area was established within hours. The Japanese strategy on Okinawa was to defend the southern part of the island, where the terrain was rugged and suitable for defensive positions. The Shuri Line, a belt of fortifications stretching across the island just north of the port of Naha, was the main defensive position. The Japanese had constructed an elaborate system of caves, tunnels, and interconnected bunkers. The caves were difficult to locate from the air, and they were resistant to bombardment from the naval guns. The fighting on Okinawa was the most intense of the Pacific War. The Japanese defended every cave and every ridge with fanatical determination. The 10th Army advanced slowly, yard by yard. The casualties were heavy on both sides. Ordnance units worked under constant artillery and mortar fire. The depot barges were kept offshore, moving from beach to beach as the front shifted. The supply of ammunition was the critical factor in sustaining the offensive. The cave positions proved resistant to standard artillery. The 105mm howitzer could not penetrate the thick coral overhead cover. The 155mm howitzer was more effective but could not be moved close enough to the front due to the rough terrain. The solution was the 240mm howitzer, which had been developed for use in Italy against the German fortifications at Monte Cassino. A battery of 240mm howitzers was shipped to Okinawa and emplaced behind the American lines. The 240mm howitzer fired a 360-pound high-explosive projectile that could penetrate 20 feet of coral. The shells were so heavy that they had to be unloaded from the ships by crane and transported to the gun positions by special trailers. The rate of fire was slow, 1 round every 3 minutes, but the effect on the Japanese cave positions was devastating. The gunners could place a round directly into a cave entrance, collapsing the entire position. The 240mm howitzer became the decisive weapon on the Shuri Line. The mud on Okinawa was as bad as anything encountered in the Pacific. The monsoon rains began in May and did not let up for weeks. The roads turned into rivers of mud, vehicles bogged down on the main supply routes. Ordnance crews worked around the clock to keep the roads open. They used captured Japanese bulldozers to drag stuck trucks out of the mud. The maintenance workload increased dramatically as engines and transmissions failed under the strain of operating in the viscous ooze. The Weasel, a tracked cargo carrier designed for swampy terrain, was brought to Okinawa in limited numbers. The Weasel could traverse mud that would stop any wheeled vehicle. It was used primarily to transport ammunition from the beach dumps to the forward positions. The Weasel had a cargo capacity of 1,000 pounds, which was enough to supply a company of infantry for 1 day. The vehicle was noisy and slow, but it was invaluable in the conditions on Okinawa. The supply of ammunition by water became the primary method of moving material forward during the monsoon. The depot barges were beached at points close to the front, and the ammunition was unloaded directly onto tracked vehicles. This bypassed the congested roads and reduced the distance that the ammunition had to be carried overland. The system was efficient, but it required careful coordination between the Navy, the Transportation Corps, and the Ordnance Department. The coordination was achieved through a joint logistics staff that met daily. The emergency barge shipments were the final link in the supply chain. When the front outran the road network, the depot barges would beach at the nearest point, and the infantry would carry the ammunition forward by hand. This was the most dangerous method of resupply, because the infantry were already under fire. The ordnance troops who accompanied the barges often came under fire themselves. Several depot barges were hit by Japanese artillery, but the ammunition was saved by the quick action of the crews. The flame-throwing tank became the signature weapon of the Okinawa campaign. The Japanese cave positions could not be reduced by artillery alone. The infantry needed a weapon that could project fire into the depths of the caves, killing the defenders without requiring the attackers to enter the confined spaces. The standard M4 Sherman tank was fitted with the E-45 flamethrower, which used a compressed air system to project a stream of burning fuel up to 80 yards. The flame-throwing Shermans were organized into specialized units. Each tank carried 200 gallons of fuel, enough for about 30 seconds of continuous flame. The tanks were used in support of infantry assaults on the fortified ridges. When a cave was identified, the flame tank would advance to within 50 yards and project a stream of burning fuel into the entrance. The effect was instantaneous. The defenders were either incinerated or suffocated. Those who fled the cave were cut down by infantry fire. The flame-throwing tank was not a new weapon. It had been used in the European theater against German bunkers. But on Okinawa, it was used on a scale that had not been attempted before. The Ordnance Department had developed the E-45 flamethrower as a field modification kit that could be installed on any Sherman tank. The kit included the fuel tanks, the compressed air system, and the nozzle assembly. The installation could be completed in about 8 hours by a trained ordnance team. The Okinawa campaign lasted 82 days. The fighting was brutal. The casualties were staggering. The 10th Army lost over 12,000 killed and 50,000 wounded. The Japanese lost over 100,000 killed. The island was finally declared secure on the 22nd of June 1945. The Ordnance Department had fired over 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition and over 10 million rounds of small arms ammunition during the campaign. The supply system had never faltered. The flame-throwing tank had proven its value in the cave fighting. The Ordnance Department began planning for a standardized flame tank that would be used in the invasion of Japan. The new tank, designated the M4A3E8 with the E45 flamethrower, was designed to carry 300 gallons of fuel and have a range of 150 yards. The production order was placed in July of 1945. The first production models were scheduled for delivery in October. The preparations for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, were the most extensive of the war. The Ordnance Department was responsible for supplying a force of over 5 million men. The ammunition requirements were enormous. The depots on Okinawa and Luzon were expanded to their maximum capacity. The depot barge fleet was increased to over 200 vessels. The entire logistical system of the Pacific Theater was geared toward the final assault on the Japanese home islands. On the 6th of August 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed the city and killed over 80,000 people. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese government, recognizing that further resistance was futile, announced its surrender on the 15th of August. The war was over. The preparations for the invasion of Japan were suddenly rendered moot. The end of the war came as a shock to the ordnance troops in the Pacific. They had been preparing for the largest operation in history. The depots were full. The depot barges were loaded. The troops were ready. Now the mission had changed. Instead of supplying an invasion, they would be responsible for the occupation of Japan and the demobilization of the American forces. The transition was abrupt, but the Ordnance Department adapted quickly. The formal surrender ceremony took place on the 2nd of September, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur accepted the surrender of the Japanese government. The war that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor nearly 4 years earlier was finally over. The Ordnance Department had played a vital role in the victory, supplying the weapons and ammunition that had enabled the American forces to prevail in the largest and most complex military campaign in history. The demobilization of the American forces began immediately after the surrender. The Ordnance Department was responsible for collecting and processing the huge inventory of weapons and equipment that had been built up over 4 years of war. The depots on Okinawa, Luzon, and Leyte were filled to capacity. The depot barges were beached and their contents inventoried. The surplus equipment was either shipped back to the United States for storage or destroyed in place. The reclamation of equipment was a massive undertaking. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces had to be inspected, repaired, and either returned to service or scrapped. Ordnance teams worked through the depots, sorting usable equipment from worn-out material. The usable equipment was shipped to depots in the United States for storage. The worn-out equipment was stripped of usable parts and then scrapped. The process took over a year to complete. The atomic bomb had changed the nature of warfare. The invasion of Japan had been planned on a scale that would have dwarfed the Normandy landings. The Ordnance Department had prepared for it. The depots were full. The depot barges were loaded. The flame-throwing tanks were ready. But the atomic bomb had made the invasion unnecessary. The war had ended with a single weapon that had the destructive power of the entire Allied bomber fleet. The Ordnance Department had learned many lessons in the Pacific. The most important was the value of forward planning. The depot barge system, the beach maintenance area concept, and the mobile supply point doctrine had all been developed in response to the unique challenges of the Pacific theater. These innovations had proven their worth in campaign after campaign. They became the standard doctrine for the United States Army in the post-war era. The flame-throwing Sherman had been a specialized weapon developed for a specific tactical problem. The weapon had been effective on Okinawa, but the end of the war meant that the standardized flame tank program was cancelled. The production order was terminated. The existing flame tanks were converted back to standard configuration and placed in storage. The E4 TAF-5 flamethrower kit was retained in the Ordnance catalog, but it was never used in combat again. The Pacific War had been a proving ground for the Ordnance Department. The lessons learned in Papua, at Buna, at Biak, and on Okinawa had shaped the development of new weapons and new doctrines. The ordnance officers who had served in the Pacific took their experience with them to the post-war army. The system of forward-based support, the use of depot barges, and the emphasis on maintenance in harsh environments all became part of the standard ordnance curriculum. The Ordnance Department had begun the war with a handful of aviation companies in Australia and a small staff in London. By the end of the war, it was a global organization with over 300,000 soldiers. It had supplied the largest army in American history across 2 oceans and 6 continents. The scale of the achievement was unprecedented. The Ordnance Department had done its job. The weapons and equipment that had been developed during the war became the foundation of the post-war army. The M1 Garand rifle remained the standard infantry weapon for another 20 years. The M4 Sherman tank was upgraded and remained in service until the 1950s. The 105mm howitzer was adopted by armies around the world. The 240mm howitzer was retained in the inventory for use against heavily fortified positions. The legacy of the Ordnance Department's wartime effort was a modern, professional army equipped with the best weapons in the world. The administrative machine that had been built to support the war was not dismantled. The Ordnance Department remained a separate branch of the Army, with responsibility for research, development, procurement, and supply. The relationships that had been forged with American industry during the war were maintained in peacetime. The system of contracts, inspections, and quality control that had been developed to produce weapons in unprecedented quantities became the standard for the procurement of all military equipment. The Ordnance Department had transformed itself from a small peacetime organization into a global logistical system. The transformation had been accomplished under the pressure of war, with all the mistakes and corrections that such a process entailed. The lessons of the war were studied and codified. The organizational changes that had been improvised in the field, such as the group concept and the service center concept, were adopted as standard doctrine. The army that emerged from the war was fundamentally different from the army that had entered it. The human cost of the war could not be measured in terms of organizational efficiency. Over 400,000 American soldiers had died. The Ordnance Department had lost thousands of its own men, killed in action or died of disease in the jungles of the Pacific. The names of those who had fallen were recorded on the rolls of the Ordnance Corps. The Cain Ammunition Depot in Australia was a reminder of one such sacrifice. The memory of those who had served and died was preserved in the history of the branch. The Ordnance Department's role in the war was not always visible to the public. The combat infantryman did not think about who had supplied his rifle. The tank driver did not wonder who had manufactured his tank. But without the Ordnance Department, there would have been no rifles and no tanks. The Ordnance Department had kept the army supplied. It had done so across 3,000 miles of ocean and 600 miles of contested ground. The achievement was quiet, but it was essential. The final act of the Ordnance Department's war was the disposal of the vast surplus of weapons and equipment that had been produced. The warehouses were filled with enough ammunition to fight another war. The vehicle parks held tens of thousands of trucks and tanks. The artillery pieces were stacked in rows that stretched for miles. The task of disposing of this surplus was assigned to the Ordnance Department. The work continued for years after the war ended. The surplus equipment was either sold to Allied nations, transferred to reserve units, or scrapped. The process was meticulous. Every item was inspected and classified. The ammunition was either used in training or destroyed. The vehicles were either sold to farmers and businesses or broken up for scrap. The weapons were either stored in reserve arsenals or melted down. The Ordnance Department managed the process with the same attention to detail that it had applied to the procurement of the equipment in the first place. The war in the Pacific had been won by a combination of industrial might, logistical skill, and tactical ingenuity. The Ordnance Department had contributed to all three. The industrial mobilization had produced the weapons in numbers that the enemy could not match. The logistical system had delivered those weapons to the far corners of the Pacific. The tactical innovations, from the hedgerow cutter to the flame-throwing tank, had given the American soldier the tools he needed to win. The Ordnance Department had learned to operate in the most difficult environments on Earth. The jungles of New Guinea, the coral ridges of Biak, the mud of Okinawa. The troops had adapted to each new challenge. They had improvised solutions to problems that had not been anticipated by the planners. They had worked under fire, in the heat, in the rain, in the mud. They had kept the weapons firing and the vehicles moving. They had done their duty. The legacy of the Ordnance Department's Pacific campaign was not just a catalogue of weapons and procedures, it was a tradition of service and sacrifice. The Ordnance troops who had served in the Pacific had proven that the technical services could operate in the most demanding conditions. They had earned the respect of the combat arms. The Ordnance Corps of the post-war army was built on the foundation of their experience. The war in the Pacific had been a war of logistics. The distances were vast, the terrain was hostile, and the enemy was determined. The Ordnance Department had met every challenge. The supply lines had been stretched to the breaking point, but they had never broken. The ammunition had always arrived. The spare parts had always been available. The weapons had always been repaired. The Ordnance Department had kept the army in the fight. The war ended on the 2nd of September 1945. The Ordnance Department's mission was complete. The task now was to bring the troops home and to preserve the peace. The Ordnance Department had done its part to secure that peace. The weapons that had been produced, the supplies that had been delivered, and the lives that had been given had all contributed to the victory. The Ordnance Department had served the nation well. The surrender documents were signed on the deck of the Missouri. General MacArthur addressed the assembled representatives of the Allied nations. He spoke of the need for peace and reconciliation. The war was over. The Ordnance Department had played a vital role in the victory. The story of that role was recorded in the archives of the branch. The history of the Ordnance Department in World War II was a story of innovation, dedication, and sacrifice. The Ordnance Department had begun the war with a small staff in Washington and a handful of arsenals. It had ended the war as a global organization with depots on every continent. The scale of the achievement was without precedent. The Ordnance Department had produced and delivered more weapons and ammunition than any other nation in history. The American soldier had been the best-equipped fighting man in the world. The Ordnance Department had made that possible. The legacy of the Ordnance Department's wartime effort was a modern professional army. The organizational innovations that had been developed in the field were adopted as standard doctrine. The group concept, the service center concept, and the beach maintenance area concept all became part of the Ordnance Corps' standard operating procedures. The lessons learned in the war were taught to every new generation of ordnance officers. The tradition of excellence was maintained. The weapons that had been developed during the war continued to serve for decades. The M1 Garand rifle remained the standard infantry weapon until the 1960s. The M4 Sherman tank was upgraded and remained in service. The 105mm howitzer was adopted by armies around the world. The designs that had been proven in combat were retained in the inventory. The Ordnance Corps continued to improve on them. incorporating the lessons of battlefield experience. The human cost of the war was borne by the soldiers who served. The Ordnance Department had lost thousands of men. They were buried in cemeteries across the Pacific, on islands whose names had become synonymous with sacrifice. The Kane Ammunition Depot, named for a young lieutenant who had died on a blockade-running mission, was a reminder of the cost. The memory of those who had fallen was preserved in the history of the branch. The Ordnance Corps honored their sacrifice. The depot barges and the flame-throwing tanks and the 240mm howitzers are now artifacts in museums. But the system that delivered them to the front, the system of forward planning and logistical coordination and field maintenance, is still the foundation of the modern army. The Ordnance Corps continues to serve the nation, providing the logistical support that makes combat operations possible. The lessons of World War II are still taught in ordnance schools. The tradition continues. The Ordnance Department's contribution to the victory in World War II is a story of innovation, dedication, and sacrifice. The troops who served in the Ordnance Corps were not always in the headlines, but they were essential to the success of every campaign. They kept the weapons firing and the vehicles moving. They worked under fire and in difficult conditions. They never quit. The Ordnance Corps is proud of its history. The nation owes them a debt of gratitude. If you or your family have any connection to the Ordnance Department or to the Pacific campaigns of World War II, please share your stories in the comments below. We would be honored to hear from you. And if you found this documentary valuable, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like to support our future historical work. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.